Sometimes, the most horrific tragedies occur in the very places we believe to be the safest. From quiet street corners in Scarborough to silent warehouse districts in Vaughan, the overseas Vietnamese community has repeatedly been forced to confront brutal and deeply mysterious crimes. In this episode, Vietnamese Case Files revisits 8 shocking cases in Canada and the United States, where dark conspiracies and violence claimed numerous lives. We trace the stories from the unjust death of Cum Thon Tut, the disappearance of the couple Quoc Trun and Christy Wen, to the series of 8 linked murders in Edmonton. These cases go beyond domestic violence or personal disputes, such as the tragedy involving the family of Thuy Vu. We also venture into the blood-soaked underworld through gang purges like the Surrey 6 case, the shooting at the Bolsa restaurant, and the death of gang leader Mad Dragon David Than Lam. The video even exposes the hidden rot within law enforcement itself through the case of former police officer Andrew Nguyen. And if you enjoy investigative true crime content and want to follow along with Vietnamese Case Files and upcoming cases, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. Now, let's begin. On the afternoon of October 19th, 2007, everyday life at Balmoral Tower, located at 9,830 Wally Blufford in Surrey, Canada, was abruptly shattered by a horrific discovery. Building manager Norman Carruthers, while checking on a unit on the 15th floor apartment, 1505, was horrified to find multiple bodies lying face down and motionless on the floor with blood scattered throughout. Panicked, he immediately called the police. Minutes later, the once quiet condominium was tightly sealed off by officers. Inside that 15th floor unit, the scene looked like an execution room. 6 male bodies were found sprawled across the living room and hallway. Several of them had jackets or hats pulled over their heads, as if the killer didn't want to look at their faces while pulling the trigger. Later autopsy results showed that most of the victims were shot from extremely close range in the back of the neck or the back of the head, a method associated with the underworld's leave no loose ends mentality. A total of 19 shell casings were recovered at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry. It appeared the victims had opened the door for the killer. The apartment had been ransacked, drawers and cabinets left wide open. Taken together, police quickly sensed from the start that this was a deliberate, gang-related purge. The killer stormed in, restrained the victims, searched for valuables, then calmly shot them one by one. But who were the victims? And why were they executed in such a savage way? Police noted that one older victim, dressed in a repairman's uniform, was lying beside a toolkit and a stove that was in the middle of being dismantled, suggesting he may have been a technician simply doing his job. Another was a young man in everyday clothes. Near him were a set of apartment keys and a mobile phone, implying he may have been a nearby resident. This raised a chilling possibility. Innocent people may have been caught up in the execution. The case then was no longer just a matter of criminal vendettas. It had become a tragedy for the entire community. Setting aside their sympathy for the victims, police had to focus on confirming each identity and turning those names into investigative leads. That same evening, forensic examination and identification were carried out urgently. Early results suggested that 4 of the younger victims were individuals with known profiles in police files. However, the remaining 2 victims did not match any criminal record. Police then shifted to another approach, cross-checking the building's resident list and everyone known to have been on the premises. At that point, a woman who lived on the 15th floor, Eileen Mohan, rushed to officers and reported that she had lost contact with her son, Christopher Mohan, all afternoon. Christopher had been home waiting to have lunch with her, but when she called, he never picked up. A growing sense of dread made Mrs. Mohan leave work and rush home to look for him. Seeing the mother's anxious face, police quietly brought out a victim photo for comparison. Eileen's heart shattered when she was told that one of the 6 victims was her only son. To his family, Christopher Mohan was a good kid who loved sports and had never been involved in any legal trouble. But the tragedy didn't end there. Investigators also determined that the older man who died was Ed Schellenberg, 55 years old, an HVAC, furnace technician from the nearby city of Abbotsford, on the 15th floor to service equipment for the apartments. Neighbors and friends remembered him as hardworking, kind, and devoted to his family. The identities of the other 4 victims were gradually released, and that helped explain why the scene was soaked in blood. They were all players in the drug trade. Corey Lau, 21 years old, the younger brother of Michael Lau, 26 years old. Edward Eddie Narong, 22 years old, and Ryan Bartolomeo, 19 years old. These four young men were closely associated as their own clique, referred to by police as the Lau Group because it was led by the Lau brothers. Apartment 1505, the murder scene, was also their base of operations, a place where deals and gatherings reportedly took place regularly. Records also showed that Eddie Narong had once been a co-founder of the Red Scorpions gang, but had recently split off to form his own crew. Michael and Corey Lau both had prior drug trafficking records, and were also linked to an Asian gang known as the Independent Soldiers. Ryan Bartolomeo was only 19, yet had already been tied to several incidents involving weapons and controlled substances. So who wanted these four underworld figures dead? Investigators understood that the answer likely lay in the Lau Group's connections and conflicts with larger gangs. Soon after, police received intelligence that Jamie Bacon, the leader of the Red Scorpions, had demanded that Corey Lau pay a protection fee of $100,000 in order to traffic drugs in Surrey. Corey not only refused to pay, but allegedly responded in a defiant, challenging manner. If so, that could be the motive behind the death sentence handed to the Lau brothers and their associates. However, at that point, police still had no concrete evidence. No direct witnesses were willing to come forward either. Investigators had to intensify their efforts. They reviewed security camera footage from the building and nearby areas and found elevator lobby footage showing that at around 2:40 p.m. On October 19th, 2007, several figures hurriedly left the building. Helen Lee, a resident on a lower floor, also told police she saw three unfamiliar men wearing hooded sweatshirts, with the hoods up, gloves on, moving quickly past the building entrance late that afternoon. They deliberately kept their faces down to avoid the cameras, and one of them even pulled his hood lower to cover most of his face. That made it very likely they were the perpetrators. One suspect was shorter than the other two and wore a gray top. The other two were taller and larger, dressed in black. Even so, identifying them precisely was impossible at that stage. With no direct evidence, investigators shifted to surveillance of potential suspects. The Bacon brothers and their close associates were placed under round-the-clock scrutiny. Court-authorized wiretaps were also used in hopes of catching any careless talk about the murders, but nothing useful surfaced. Police then pivoted to a bold psychological tactic, approaching people close to the suspects. They focused especially on girlfriends and wives of Red Scorpions members, believing they could be the weak links most vulnerable to pressure and most likely to share information. Over the 6 months after the murders, police covertly befriended and courted the trust of several suspects' girlfriends, persuading them to cooperate as witnesses. One investigator, Douglas Brassington, even became romantically involved with Jamie Bacon's ex-girlfriend, and the two had sex while she was staying in a witness protection hotel. But the real turning point came from inside the gang itself, when someone involved turned himself in. It was Dennis Carbovanek, also known as Person X, a trusted Bacon associate and a Red Scorpions member. On April 3rd, 2009, Carbovanek went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and confessed that he had taken part in killing 3 of the victims, including Chris Mohan. He said seeing Eileen Mohan, Chris's mother, speaking about her grief on television had filled him with guilt and pushed him to confess. Based on his statement, the next day, April 4th, 2009, police carried out a series of rapid arrests. 2 associates, Cody Ray Hayvisher and Matthew James Johnston, were taken into custody, and gang boss Jamie Bacon was also captured. Records indicate the tactical unit used an armored vehicle and a surprise entry strategy to storm the Bacon family's base in Abbotsford and subdue him as a high-risk suspect. From here, the profile of these notorious gang figures gradually came into focus. James Kyle. Jamie Bacon was born in 1985 into a middle-class family in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He didn't grow up deprived. His father was a teacher, and his mother worked at a bank. In high school, Jamie Bacon was a ranked wrestler, while his older brother Jonathan Bacon was remembered by friends as a pretty likable guy. But by their late teens, the Bacon brothers began sliding deeper into crime. According to many experts, they didn't enter the underworld out of poverty, but out of a hunger for money and status, things that could be gained quickly in that world. In 2006, the 2 brothers joined forces with the Red Scorpions to expand their influence. In a short time, Bacon rose into an ambitious young leader within the Red Scorpions, willing to use brutal violence to seize control of the market across the Lower Mainland. Arrogant and bloodthirsty, Jamie Bacon was known for wearing a bulletproof vest and being ready to fight whenever he went out. He survived an assassination attempt in April 2007, and because he was wearing body armor, he suffered only a graze to the head. But instead of backing off, Bacon treated it as part of the game and grew even more brazen. He became increasingly aggressive and muscle-obsessed, keeping up a hard, intimidating persona, quiet, sullen, feared by both friends and enemies. In the Surrey operation, Jamie Bacon did not pull the trigger himself, but he was the one directing everything from the shadows, showing extreme ruthlessness by deciding to eliminate even innocent people purely to tie off loose ends. Under Bacon were his trusted enforcers, also the men who fired the shots in the massacre. Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston were both around 23 to 24 years old at the time and were prominent Red Scorpions members. Bacon relied on them as frontline soldiers for their recklessness and loyalty. In the criminal underworld, Havisher and Johnston had been involved in higher debt collections, drug trafficking, and were willing to use weapons for the gang's benefit. Dennis Karbovanek, the one who later turned himself in, was also a seasoned butcher. All three had red scorpion tattoos as a symbol of loyalty to the gang. They regarded Jamie Bacon as a supreme leader. Once he gave an order, they carried it out without question. But that wasn't all. Among those tied to the case was a Vietnamese-Canadian co-conspirator named Michael Lay, one of the Red Scorpions co-founders, and a former prison associate of Eddie Narong. He was born in Canada to a Vietnamese family. In his youth, he became entangled in a homicide case, but narrowly escaped the heaviest consequences after a successful appeal reduced the conviction to a lesser charge. After his release, Michael Lay was determined to revive the Red Scorpions and eliminate rebellious factions. That made the Lau brothers' defiance unacceptable. But at this point, Michael Lay seemed to vanish into thin air. Authorities immediately issued an international warrant for his arrest. Investigators later learned that Michael Lay had fled to Vietnam and then moved through other Southeast Asian countries. But there was no escaping the net. On June 17, 2009, Michael Lay was arrested the moment he landed at Manila Airport in the Philippines. He was extradited back to Canada on June 29, 2009 to face justice. Around the same time, police also arrested an unexpected name, Sophan Sek, 30 years old, a broker in British Columbia's underworld. Sek was arrested on November 26, 2009, shortly after a big win at the River Rock Casino. Investigators concluded that Sophan Sek was the key link that helped the killers gain access to Unit 1505. He was hired by Michael Lay for $25,000 USD to scout the target and guide the perpetrators to the 15th floor apartment. Based on the suspect's statements and the clues collected, Canadian police were able to successfully reconstruct the entire sequence of events. On the morning of October 19, 2007, a tense atmosphere hung over a meeting at a McDonald's in the Guildford area of Surrey. Jamie Bacon angrily berated Corey for poaching his business, then coldly demanded that Corey pay $100,000 USD in tax before midnight, or he would be killed. Corey Lau appeared conciliatory at the time, but had no intention of paying such a large sum. Corey's dismissive attitude pushed Bacon past his limit. That afternoon, Bacon contacted Michael Lay, and the two agreed that Corey Lau had to be sent to hell that very day. While they were at it, they would wipe out the Lau crew in one go to prevent future trouble. Bacon immediately mobilized his men. He called Cody Havisher and Matt Johnston, two loyal butchers, and ordered them to prepare their tools. Around the same time, Dennis Karbovanek was told to join in. The group readied 2 cars for transportation. At around 1 p.m, the Bacon group had one member contact Sophan Sek, the insider, who would clear the way. Sek knew Eddie Narong, so it wasn't hard to arrange a pretext to drop by Unit 1505. He texted Eddie Narong to say he was coming over. At 1:45 p.m., Cody Havisher and Matt Johnston met Dennis Karbovanek at a rendezvous point near Balmoral Tower. The killers were carrying a Glock handgun and a Sig Sauer tucked into their waistbands. Sophan Sek joined them outside the apartment building. At around 2:25 p.m., Sek buzzed in, then led 2 men in black hoodies through the entrance and into the elevator up to the 15th floor. At 2:30 p.m., there was a knock and Sek's voice. Eddie glanced through the peephole, recognized him, and unlocked the door. The moment the door cracked open, 2 dark figures rushed in with weapons raised. Inside the unit, 4 men, Corey, Michael, Eddie, and Ryan, were immediately held at gunpoint with no time to react. Ed Schellenberg, the repairman standing near the entryway, startled and turned around only to have Havister jam a gun to his neck and bark at him to lie face down. At the same time, out in the hallway, Chris Moen had just locked his own apartment door to head toward the elevator. Hearing the commotion, Chris turned and was grabbed by Dennis Karbovanek and dragged into Unit 1 505. At this point, all 6 victims were in the attacker's control. One by one, their hands were bound with pre-prepared plastic zip ties. Some victims even had their shoelaces stripped off and used to tie their wrists. Before dealing with their prey, the attackers took the opportunity to ransack the apartment for valuables. They tore through drawers, ripped open the sofa cushions, and smashed parts of the wall they suspected were hiding contraband. But aside from a few small packets of cocaine and some cash, there was nothing of real value. Finally, Havister glanced at Johnston and Karbovanek and signaled. The moment of execution had arrived. To avoid identification or blood spray, they grabbed jackets and hoodies already in the room and pulled them over each victim's head. In less than 2 minutes, the killers executed all 6 men, sparing no one. Then they fled quickly. Near 3 p.m., a basement security camera captured 3 dark figures sprinting across the parking area before disappearing. Dennis Karbovanek drove a BMW away from the scene, followed by a Touareg SUV carrying Havister and Johnston. They exited the lot and split up in multiple directions, leaving behind a horror scene no one had yet discovered. The investigation, though riddled with obstacles, ultimately exposed the full truth of what happened. But another tense chapter was about to begin inside the courtroom, where the justice system faced challenges rarely seen in a case of this magnitude. The Surrey case file was unprecedented in scale, with hundreds of witnesses and evidence ranging from wiretaps and security footage to criminal testimony. In September 2010, prosecutors formally charged 5 defendants, Cody Havister, Matthew Johnston, Jamie Bacon, and Michael Lay, with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Sofon Sek was charged as an accessory. Dennis Karbovanek, who had pleaded guilty and cooperated, was handled in a separate, closed proceeding and sentenced separately. The main trial began on September 30th, 2013 at the Supreme Court of British Columbia, trying Havister and Johnston on 6 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Michael Lay also appeared in court on an aiding and abetting charge. At the very start of the trial, the prosecutors silenced the courtroom by displaying a series of chilling crime scene photographs. Witnesses were called one after another. First was Norman Carruthers, the building manager, who described discovering 6 bodies in Unit 1505 with blood all over the floor. A witness named Jason Le, a dealer in the underworld scene, testified that on October 18th, Corey Lau came to his home and threatened him, forcing him to work for Lau, suggesting Corey Lau was expanding and clashing with other groups, indirectly pointing to a motive for Bacon to strike. Forensic investigators also presented autopsy findings. A total of 19 shots had been fired, and most victims died from close-range gunshots that pierced the skull. A focal point of the trial was testimony from confidential witnesses, people who had been involved but were granted leniency in exchange for cooperating. Dennis Karbovanek described in detail the preparation and execution of the killings, admitting he personally shot 3 people. Bacon's former girlfriend testified about instances where Bacon confessed or bragged about having taken care of the Lau group. However, her testimony sparked fierce controversy. Bacon's defense team then revealed she had an inappropriate relationship with an investigator named Brassington, arguing her statements were not credible. At the same time, that revelation triggered a major scandal within the police. Judge Catherine Wedge had to convene a special evidentiary hearing on allegations of abuse of authority, an issue that nearly collapsed 2 years of investigative work. Amid that crisis, in June 2011, provincial authorities charged 4 of their own investigators, Brassington, his supervisor, and 2 colleagues with fraud, breach of duty, and obstruction of justice. Seizing on this, defense lawyers for Havister and Johnston pressed the argument that police misconduct had tainted the evidence and undermined the possibility of a fair trial, but Judge Wedge refused to dismiss the case. She allowed the trial of Havister and Johnston to proceed while excluding certain evidence obtained through violations and instructing the jury to treat testimony from specially handled witnesses with great caution. But at the last minute, Michael Lay changed course and pleaded guilty on November 28, 2013. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But because he had already spent time in pretrial detention and showed remorse, Lay later only had to serve 3 more years. In the end, after more than a year of proceedings and a record 73 witnesses, on October 2, 2014, the court found Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston guilty on all counts and sentenced them to life in prison with no parole eligibility for at least 25 years. But the legal battle didn't end there. Just days later, their defense lawyers filed a motion to overturn the convictions again, citing police misconduct. The court reviewed the request, but ultimately dismissed it, and Havisher and Johnston remained convicted as ruled. Meanwhile, the prosecution of Jamie Bacon took many more unexpected turns. After his arrest in 2009, Bacon hired a large, high-powered legal team. He tried to stall and loudly contested every procedural issue, pushing the main trial back by years. In December 2017, a major shock hit. Justice Heather Holmes of the Supreme Court issued a permanent stay of the murder prosecution against Jamie Bacon, ruling that police and prosecutors had seriously violated Bacon's right to a fair trial. Earlier, a 2010 court decision had also gone in Bacon's favor, ordering the jail to pay damages, an outcome that stunned the victims' families and outraged the public. Facing a wave of backlash, British Columbia prosecutors appealed to the Court of Appeal. That effort succeeded. In May 2020, the Court of Appeal overturned the stay, clearing the way for Jamie Bacon to be prosecuted again. Confronted with the risk of going to trial and receiving a heavy sentence, Bacon chose to negotiate a plea deal for a lighter outcome. On July 9, 2020, Jamie Bacon formally pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and to counseling murder in a separate case. In September 2020, the court sentenced Bacon to 18 years in prison, but counting his pretrial custody, he had only 5 years and 7 months left to serve. The victims' families were, of course, unhappy with that sentence. Prosecutors explained that if they tried Bacon for murder at that point, the process could drag on for many more years and a conviction was not guaranteed, since indirect evidence had grown weaker over time. As for Stefanczak, his case also dragged on for years. Not until late 2015 did Sek plead guilty to breaking and entering with a weapon with intent to commit an indictable offense. In December 2015, the court sentenced Sek to 1 year in prison for his indirect role as the guide. And as for Denis Karbovanec, because he pleaded guilty early, even though he personally killed 3 people, he received a sentence of only 15 years. Even so, for the victims' families, the legal journey still wasn't fully over. In January 2021, the Court of Appeal issued a surprising ruling. Because new evidence of police misconduct had emerged, Havisher and Johnston were allowed to seek a hearing to have the indictment stayed. Prosecutors immediately objected strongly and appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. In April 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada issued its final decision, upholding Havisher's right to proceed with a misconduct hearing. That meant that by October 2025, the horrific massacre that happened back in 2007 still had not reached a definitive end. The victims' families continued to follow every step of the justice process. Eileen Mohan even worried that the case might still be unresolved by the time she passed away. On the morning of November 25, 2014, a driver passing along the quiet 24700 block of 64 Avenue in Langley, a suburb of Vancouver, noticed a strange, human-shaped object by the roadside. Slowing down to get a closer look, the driver was horrified to realize it was actually a human body, burned black. Panicked, the driver immediately called the Langley detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police RCMP to report the incident. It was 10:30 a.m. The information was quickly relayed to British Columbia's Integrated Homicide Investigation Team, so investigators could be dispatched as soon as possible. Minutes later, police arrived and cordoned off the area for investigation. The scene was on a deserted dirt road, private enough for the perpetrator to carry out such a brutal act without being seen. As soon as officers approached, they could tell the body had been almost completely burned. The victim lay face down near the edge of the road, with scorched grass around him. No vehicle or personal belongings remained clear signs that the killer had tried to erase the evidence. However, police still found a tire track pressed into the soft ground and a few blackened pieces of plastic that may have come from a gasoline container. From these initial observations, investigators quickly sensed a contradiction. The killer chose a remote location, yet carried out the act in a shockingly conspicuous way, clearly not intending to hide the crime, but rather to delay discovery long enough to escape. A personal vendetta rarely looks this brutal and professional, so it was likely not just murder, it was a message. The perpetrator acted coldly and methodically, executing the victim in a symbolic manner that strongly resembled a gang-style hit. So was this a warning from the underworld? A charred body as a terrifying message meant for someone still alive? With that line of reasoning, identifying the victim became critically important. However, because the body had been almost completely burned, the face severely disfigured, and no identification documents found nearby, police immediately hit a dead end in the identification process. They had to rely on forensic technicians at the Vancouver Medical Examiner's lab. After receiving the remains, staff spent hours analyzing whatever evidence was still intact: teeth, bones, or any identifying features the fire had not destroyed. A DNA sample was carefully extracted from the remaining tissue and compared against missing person databases and national criminal records. In parallel, the Integrated Homicide Investigation Team contacted police in Edmonton and surrounding areas to gather information from recent missing person reports. Just 2 days later, there was a break. The lab confirmed the victim's identity: a 34-year-old man from Edmonton named David Tan Lam. When investigators heard that name, their expressions turned grim. They had already suspected the victim was not an ordinary, innocent citizen, but someone with ties to the underworld. And indeed, David was a well-known figure who had crossed paths with police countless times. According to available information, David Than Lam was a Vietnamese-Canadian living in Edmonton, Alberta. Lam's family came to Canada after the war, carrying hopes of a better life in the Promised Land. But David Lam's teenage years were shaped by the dangerous streets of Edmonton. He dropped out early and fell in with Asian background groups living outside the law, seeking the sense of a second family. In September 1999, Edmonton police busted the gang Lam was associated with and arrested dozens of Vietnamese-Canadian members involved in drug trafficking. David Lam, then not yet 20 years old, narrowly avoided being caught, but from that point on, he sank even deeper into crime. David Lam and a few remaining associates regrouped and formed the Mad Dragon gang Rong Dien around the year 2000. From then on, David Lam became a name that carried weight in police files. His record ranged from minor offenses like public disorder to more serious crimes such as drug trafficking. But it wasn't until early 2004 that the name David Than Lam truly began drawing attention from both criminals and the media. At that time, Lam's Mad Dragon gang clashed with the White Boy Posse, an emerging and dangerous white gang in Alberta. The White Boy Posse tried to sabotage Mad Dragon's drug routes. They brazenly used a car to ram into a delivery vehicle linked to David Lam's side, aiming to disrupt cocaine trafficking. Enraged, the Mad Dragon gang retaliated boldly. In October 2004, Lam's group kidnapped and assaulted 3 White Boy Posse members, including a high-ranking member of that gang. The brazen incident brought Mad Dragon and Lam into the headlines for the first time as a new underground force in Edmonton. Police understood that an ethnic gang conflict between an Asian gang and a white gang was simmering within the city. In that turbulent year of 2004, David Lam was also directly linked to an extremely serious act of violence. On August 8, 2004, in the town of Blue River in British Columbia, a couple driving from Abbotsford had their tires shot out by an unknown group and were openly robbed. The investigation that followed led to David Lam and his associates being charged as key suspects. Normally, conduct like that could have meant many years in prison on serious violent charges. But in July 2006, he accepted a plea deal. As a result, he avoided a heavier sentence and was soon back on the street, continuing to run illegal operations. After getting out of prison, David Lam continued to rise rapidly in the criminal underworld. Tough and street smart, he quickly became a key leader of the Mad Dragon gang. With Lam's influence, the gang expanded its network beyond Edmonton, spreading across Alberta and even reaching into neighboring provinces. David Lam was feared and respected by his men because he was willing to use ruthless violence against anyone who stood in his way. As for operations, Lam and his associates mainly dealt in cocaine, sourced through routes reaching as far as the United States and Mexico, then funneled through Vancouver and onward to the prairies. Intelligence indicated the Mad Dragon Gang had once grown so powerful that it even overshadowed the Hells Angels, the notorious biker gang in Alberta's drug market between 2010 and 2012. But now, David Lamb had met law enforcement in a completely opposite role, as a victim. The fact that a heavyweight like David Lamb was executed in such a brutal way made the case even more mysterious. This was not just a straightforward homicide, it pointed to a complex web of gang connections behind it, shifting the investigation from identifying the victim to hunting down a killer operating in the shadows of the underworld. Faced with a case deeply entangled with gang activity, a special task force was quickly formed. It included investigators from British Columbia's Integrated Homicide Investigation Team, responsible for cross-regional homicides, working alongside the Alberta RCMP's anti-gang unit. From the start, investigators believed this was a targeted hit. David Lamb was not a minor figure. His enemies could have been many, from rival traffickers to even people who had once fought alongside him within his own gang. Because the crime scene offered little usable evidence, police focused on reviewing nearby traffic cameras to trace the perpetrator's movements. Their reasoning was simple. Langley may be a suburb, but it lies close to major routes. The killer may have driven in from Highway 1 and turned onto 64 Avenue. And sure enough, traffic camera footage from Highway 1 in the early hours of November 25th showed a small truck exiting near the crime scene at around 4 a.m. The image was too unclear to capture a license plate, but it was the first important lead because that vehicle may have been used to transport the victim to the dumping site. At the same time, another investigative team combed through Lamb's criminal record, his arrests, business connections, and known enemies to narrow down suspects. Police focused on two main theories. First, Lamb was killed by a rival gang. Second, he was eliminated by someone within his own circle. Under the first theory, the suspect list stretched across multiple gangs that had clashed with Mad Dragon. At the top was the White Boy Posse, the hostile white gang whose members Lamb's crew had kidnapped back in 2004. The group was infamous for extreme violence and numerous killings. Some cases even involved decapitation. But by this point, the gang's leadership had either been taken down by law enforcement or forced to keep a low profile after a major police crackdown in 2012. Even if remnants remained, they did not seem to have enough reach to travel all the way to British Columbia to execute David Lamb. If it wasn't the White Boy Posse, then who else could it be? Police immediately considered the next name, the Hells Angels, a gang known to control drug trafficking in many parts of British Columbia, while Lamb's Mad Dragon crew had been aggressively expanding in Alberta. In Alberta, the Mad Dragon gang had once even outmuscled the Hells Angels. In British Columbia, although Lamb's crew operated under the Hells Angels umbrella to obtain supply, the possibility of a quiet dispute over profits could not be ruled out. One hypothesis investigators raised was that Lamb may have violated an unwritten rule and was dealt with by the Hells Angels. In fact, past drug wars in British Columbia's lower mainland have seen multiple cases where victims were burned or dismembered as a bloody message meant to intimidate those still alive. For that reason, police paid close attention to organized crime groups in Vancouver, including Asian and South Asian crime groups, as well as Hells Angels associates. The second hypothesis, an internal purge, was even more complicated. Looking into the state of the Mad Dragon gang in 2014, police noted it had existed for over 10 years and had undergone significant turnover. Several prominent first-generation members, Lamb's contemporaries, were either dead or in prison. The gang had effectively split into two generations: seasoned senior members and a younger, more violent cohort, many of whom were local-born or from other ethnic backgrounds. Conflicts of interest and power struggles for leadership could easily have occurred within Mad Dragon. The RCMP had even documented cases of younger members turning on their elders. For example, in the summer of 2006 in Edmonton, a veteran member of the gang's predecessor group named Dung Tree Trun was shot dead in broad daylight. Therefore, given his position as the Dragon Head, David Lamb may have become a target of his own subordinates if he appeared weak or if he was seen as endangering the entire group. To test these theories, police summoned and questioned many related individuals. They brought Lamb's relatives and friends in Edmonton to the station, but most claimed they knew nothing about the victim's illegal activities and appeared frightened and evasive. As a result, witness testimony was scarce. Police also understood that in the criminal world, a code of silence prevents anyone from speaking up if they don't want to face consequences. Gathering information from the underworld stalled. No one dared provide leads about Lam's conflicts before his death, even though rumors circulated that he had issues with certain people. Investigators had to rely on specialized methods instead. They discreetly surveilled suspected figures, monitored phone activity tied to the last contacts in Lam's call history using telecom-provided data, and analyzed location data to trace the victim's movements in the days leading up to his death. The results showed that Lam left Edmonton for Metro Vancouver about 1 week before he was killed, then moved repeatedly between Asian community hotspots in Vancouver. This suggested he had gone to British Columbia to deal with business. One anonymous source even told police that Lam had been seen at a casino in Richmond with several unfamiliar Eastern European men 2 days before he went missing. Gradually, potential suspects were eliminated. At first, a white boy posse member living in Alberta drew suspicion because he had once sworn to take revenge on Lam. But checks showed that in late 2014, the man was serving a federal prison sentence and could not have committed the crime. The Vancouver chapter of the Hells Angels was also closely scrutinized. However, the Hells Angels operate with a high degree of organization. If they make a move, there is usually some tip-off, or at least intelligence, from specialized units. Yet police monitoring them reported no unusual activity around the time Lam was killed. So while that angle could not be completely ruled out, it temporarily lacked evidence. Police then shifted focus to active Mad Dragon members. They discovered that several key figures from the group suddenly went into hiding and left Edmonton shortly after Lam's death. For example, one of Lam's close associates, nicknamed Mike, suddenly vanished. Rumor had it he fled to Toronto to lay low in late 2014. Could Mike have been involved in his boss's death? A smaller hypothesis gradually took shape. Lam may have been set up by a few of his own underlings, colluding with another gang in order to divide the territory and profits. However, the case's knot still could not be fully untied, because there was no direct evidence confirming who the final killers were. Just as the investigation seemed to be stalling, an unexpected lead partially opened a path to the truth. In early 2015, Metro Vancouver police arrested a suspect in another contraband case. At first, he appeared unrelated, but during questioning, he blurted out a boast that he had watched a guy from Edmonton get roasted. That chilling detail matched Lam's case and immediately alarmed investigators. The man belonged to a local Vancouver criminal group and had reportedly acted as a broker between Asian supply sources and dealers in the Prairie region, meaning he could plausibly have known Lam and been connected to the killing. Investigators moved quickly to press him for more. Unfortunately, he soon clammed up completely, likely out of fear of retaliation. Even so, that tiny piece of information helped confirm the investigative direction. The perpetrators were likely a criminal crew with connections in both Vancouver and Edmonton. With that lead, the task force launched coordinated operations, working with the Criminal Intelligence Service Canada and the RCMP Major Crimes Unit based in Alberta to map out links between the Mad Dragon Gang and other groups. Specialized techniques were deployed: phone network analysis, tracking laundered money through bank flows, and even undercover infiltration by posing as contraband buyers. Every fragment of information was carefully threaded together, like assembling pieces of a massive puzzle. In the end, a broader picture of the motive began to emerge. David Lam had likely become embroiled in a profit dispute with his own supply-side partners. His trip to British Columbia may have been to negotiate or to fight over a major deal. There, former partners may have turned on him. It is possible Lam was lured to a remote location with promises of a delivery or cash when what truly awaited him was a death sentence. Based on investigative materials, police believe at least 2 to 3 perpetrators took part in eliminating Lam. They likely shot him or inflicted a swift, decisive injury to his neck, then transported him to an isolated area and set him on fire during the night. The cold, professional nature of the act suggested the group had done this before, or was directed by an experienced ringleader. Although investigators could not yet name every individual responsible, the task force believed the case's trajectory was now clear. What remained was to gather enough legal proof to make arrests. In June 2015, Alberta and British Columbia police quietly presented the Lam case file to prosecutors. However, arrest warrants for the individuals who directly carried out the killing still could not be issued due to the lack of confirming witnesses and insufficient physical evidence at the scene. The investigation has not fully reached its end. Even so, the case remains open, because police believe David Lam's death was not an isolated homicide, but a key thread that could unravel the Mad Dragon Empire's operations over many years. They believe that one day, if a single link in this criminal chain begins to crack, the perpetrators' identities will surface and justice will be served. And although the full truth has not been uncovered, based on the leads collected and several working theories, police have been able to outline the main sequence of events. In late November 2014, David Lam traveled to Vancouver to meet a group of partners to discuss a major deal. In that group was someone we'll call A middle-aged Asian trafficker who had previously supplied product to the Mad Dragon gang. A was accompanied by two trusted associates, one of whom was of Eastern European origin. On the surface, the meeting seemed smooth. A invited Lam to drink and negotiate. But behind A's smile was a calculation he had received instructions from a boss in Vancouver that David Lam had to be eliminated. In other words, Lam's death sentence had been decided in secret. All three men agreed to prepare for the hit. On the night of November 24th into the early hours of November 25th, 2014, David Lam received another message arranging a private meeting to conduct a quiet product transaction and avoid attention. The chosen location was a remote area in Langley, close to Vancouver, yet isolated enough. David Lam, a man who had survived plenty of danger, stayed alert, but he never expected that this time he was walking straight into a death trap. He got into A's vehicle, with A's two associates seated in the back. At around 4 a.m. on November 25th, the vehicle drove to the 24700 block of 64 Avenue in Langley. Outside, the night was pitch black. A signaled for the car to stop at an empty roadside lot, pretending the goods were stashed nearby. The moment Lam stepped out before he could react, A's two associates rushed him from behind. In an instant, a dull, dry pop sounded, and a bullet slammed straight into the back of David Lam's head. It was cold, fast, efficient. They chose a shot to the head to ensure he would not survive. But the job wasn't finished. The most critical part was disposing of the body. A searched Lam, taking his wallet, phone, and any identification, anything that could delay recognition or lead investigators to a trail. The two associates quickly poured gasoline over the body. Then a match flared, and the small flame was tossed in. In a blink, fire surged and began consuming the motionless body. The blaze reflected off the killers' faces, revealing their complete lack of emotion. They stood and watched for a moment, making sure the flames were strong enough to erase everything. Once they were certain there was no turning back, the group climbed into the vehicle. The truck sped into the night, leaving behind a roaring fire and a thick column of black smoke rising into the sky. The message the killers intended to send was simple. Anyone who betrays them or owes them will end up like that mad dragon. The murder was savage, yet tightly executed. All that remained was a body burned to ash. And to the killers, that was the end of a problem in their business. And even without an arrest, the murder of David Thun Lam and the Mad Dragon file left a heavy aftertaste in Canadian public memory. As the story surfaced, many people were shaken to realize that even in places that seem peaceful, a brutal underworld can exist right alongside everyday life. As for the Mad Dragon gang, losing its leader was like a snake losing its head, and the group gradually declined. In the years that followed, its members were arrested one by one and brought to court, closing a dark chapter of Vietnamese-linked organized crime in this North American country. In the criminal world, some even celebrated, declaring, "The Mad Dragon has finally gone to sleep." Even so, criminology experts quickly warned that the vacuum left by Mad Dragon could be filled by another group. And indeed, just a few years later, new gangs emerged in Canada, such as the 856 gang, spreading from British Columbia into the Northwest Territories, taking over the role Mad Dragon once played in northern contraband routes. This shows that the fight against organized crime never truly stops, and police must stay alert to new evolutions of these networks. On the evening of September 18th, 2021, the Nguyen family had planned a get-together. However, the couple, Quoc Trun and Christy Nguyen, unexpectedly didn't show up. Normally, they were punctual and considerate, and if they were going to be late or couldn't make it, they would always let the family know. After waiting and hearing nothing, Christy's parents grew anxious. The next morning, they rushed to the police station to file a report, fearing something terrible had happened. A missing persons case file was opened immediately. According to that file, before disappearing, Kwok and Christy had driven to their garden shop in Vaughan and planned to return home for the family gathering that evening. At 4:50 p.m., on September 18th, the couple was seen near Warden Avenue and Highway 7 in Markham, very close to their home, suggesting they may have stopped to buy something. After that, they drove to their warehouse, Unit 6 at 111 Zenway Boulevard, Vaughan, where their shop was located, at around 5:30 p.m. From that moment on, no one saw them leave. At this point, the only viable potential scene was the warehouse where they were last seen. The investigative team went straight to Unit 6, Ultra Garden Supply, the next day to look for clues. Outside, the warehouse door was still shut, with no obvious signs of disturbance. But one detail immediately put seasoned investigators on high alert. The couple's car was still parked out front, meaning they didn't drive away. That suggested something happened to them inside the unit. Detectives quietly gathered nearby security camera footage and secured the area in preparation for a search. Their instincts told them that behind this mysterious absence could be a gruesome crime. When they entered Unit 6, investigators were met with a silence that felt unnervingly heavy. In the retail area where garden equipment was sold, everything was still neatly arranged, with no sign of a break-in or robbery. However, trained eyes quickly picked up small dark stains on the floor and wall that appeared to be dried blood. In the rear storage area, a faint odor of cleaning chemicals lingered, further supporting the theory that someone had tried to scrub the scene. Most notably, both of their IDs, wallets, and phones were still inside, strongly indicating they did not leave the warehouse willingly. Rather, they likely became victims right there at the scene. The building where Kwok and Christy rented their storage unit had several surveillance cameras facing the front parking lot and the shared passageway at the back. On September 19th, police obtained footage showing the couple arriving at the unit at 5:30 p.m. On September 18th, then walking inside. After that, the door closed and they were not seen coming back out. Not long later, the camera captured a strange man briefly appearing near the unit's entrance, though the image was unclear. Detectives immediately suspected he could be the killer, or at the very least, someone directly connected to what happened on that fateful day. The problem was that, at this point, the case had no witnesses, no bodies, and no unmistakable signs of a crime. Finding a lead on the perpetrator was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Police rushed to deploy deeper investigative techniques, hoping to uncover clues and expose the full truth. The top priority at this stage was to build a profile of the victims in order to map out their relationship circles. The family said Quoc Trun, 37, and Christy Nguyen, 25, were a Vietnamese-Canadian couple living in Markham, Ontario. Quoc Trun was hardworking and ambitious. He had built his own business by opening Ultra Garden Supply, which sold gardening equipment and hydroponic systems based in Vaughan. Even though he launched the shop during the COVID-19 outbreak, Kwok's business still did well thanks to rising demand for home growing. He was planning to expand into other markets once things stabilized. In daily life, Kwok was loved by friends and family for being gentle and responsible. To his family, he was a devoted son who always put his loved ones first. Christy Nguyen, Kwok's girlfriend, was intelligent and full of drive. She graduated from Wilfrid Laurier University in 2018 with a major in psychology and was continuing to complete a paralegal certification at Seneca College in Toronto. Christy had interned at a law firm and dreamed of becoming a professional lawyer. In the near future, Christy planned to go to the United Kingdom to pursue a Master of Laws, taking her career one step further. However, for the time being, she put studying abroad on hold and chose to stay to help manage her mother's local nail salon, while gaining business experience and taking care of her mother at the same time. Relatives described Christy as multi-talented, kind, and deeply affectionate, often the emotional anchor for her siblings at home. Kwok and Christy met within the Vietnamese community in the Greater Toronto area. Despite the age gap, they clicked immediately and quickly became inseparable. By 2021, as their relationship grew serious, they began planning for marriage. Kwok had visited Christy's family to formally ask permission to marry her, following Vietnamese tradition. Both families were also preparing to meet and discuss wedding plans for 2022. Christy was especially excited. She wanted to become a bride soon and had already made many plans for the future. And yet, on September 18th, 2021, just 1 week after Christy attended the wedding of Kwok's older brother and dreamed of her own, both of them vanished into a tragedy beyond words. They were young, filled with hopes and ambitions. Both were the pride of their families and a source of support for those around them, with no known major conflicts in their community. So what could possibly explain how they disappeared without a trace? After many days of hitting a dead end, on September 27th, 2021, police decided to seal off the entire warehouse complex at 111 Zenway Boulevard for a more thorough search. Every square meter of the scene was combed through. They even gathered all trash bins around the area and searched inside them. Investigators also collected security camera footage as extensively as possible, including from businesses several kilometers away, hoping to trace any unfamiliar vehicle entering or leaving the area that night. Then a crucial lead emerged. One security camera captured something unusual at 11:30 p.m. on September 18th. In the dim, grainy frame, a large white box truck quietly drove into the alley behind the warehouse complex, stopping right by the rear entrance of Unit 6. The truck paused for a moment, then drove off into the night. On a weekend night, when the entire area was closed, the appearance of a delivery-style truck that late was extremely suspicious. Investigators believed this vehicle was the key to unraveling the mystery. It may have carried something away from the scene, most likely the victims' bodies. Police immediately released images of the suspicious truck to the public on September 28th, urging anyone with information to come forward. That same day, they made a shocking announcement. Based on the evidence so far, York Regional Police believed the missing couple had been murdered at the scene on the night of September 18th, and that it was a targeted attack. A nationwide manhunt was launched across Canada for a name previously unknown to the public, Phuong Thanh Nguyen, also known as Mike, 35 from Toronto, wanted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news instantly drew widespread attention. Who was Phuong Thanh Nguyen? Why was he suspected of being the killer? He shared a last name with one of the victims. Did that mean someone from within the family turned on them? Police quickly clarified. Despite sharing the surname Nguyen, the suspect was not related by blood to the victim Christy. The surname is simply very common in the Vietnamese community. However, police stated the killer knew the victims and that the case had a clear motive, though they could not yet disclose details in order to protect the investigation. While the hunt for the main suspect continued, the box truck lead produced fast results. Just 1 day after the public appeal, on September 29th, 2021, police arrested Ricaldo Liebert, 36, from Vaughan. He was identified as the driver of the truck seen that night. Liebert was charged as an accessory after the fact in connection with the 2 victims. According to initial information, he did not take part in the killings, but helped the perpetrator dispose of evidence and cover up what happened. Liebert's arrest was a major breakthrough, because police now had a crucial living witness, someone who could help them trace Phuong Mike Nguyen's whereabouts and motive. Through interrogation and expanded investigation, detectives gradually reconstructed a chilling picture of how the bodies were disposed of. They also tracked the box truck's route that night and worked with the local waste management company. Records showed that large dumpsters around Vaughan were collected by garbage trucks on September 24th, 2021, 6 days after the incident. In particular, 2 industrial dumpsters were hauled away from the area and dumped at 2 different landfills. Part of the waste was taken to the Twin Creeks Environmental Center in Watford, Ontario, near the city of Sarnia, about 250 kilometers west of the scene. The remaining waste may have been transported to a landfill across the United States border, possibly in the state of Michigan. This information matched Liebert's statements, helping investigators narrow down where to search for the victims' remains. On October 1st, 2021, York Regional Police held a press conference to announce heartbreaking news. After days of effort, they had located Kwok Trun's body at the Twin Creeks landfill in Watford. His remains had been hidden among the trash, and it took multiple days of sifting to recover them. A preliminary examination suggested the male victim was killed with a firearm. However, Christy Nguyen's body had still not been found. Police believed she might be in the same Twin Creeks landfill, or she may have been transported to a landfill in the United States. The investigative team dug through tons of waste for weeks afterward, but with no result. Even so, based on evidence from the scene and witness testimony, police stated that Christy was killed at the same time as Quoc Trun. Throughout the final months of 2021 and into 2022, the search for Phuong Mike Nguyen expanded internationally. Investigators determined that the suspect fled immediately after the killing. He was recorded boarding a flight out of Toronto to Mexico on September 22, 2021, just 4 days after the murders. After that, he vanished. In the latest developments, Canadian police coordinated with Interpol and Mexican authorities to hunt him worldwide. By January 2023, York Regional Police decided to intensify the manhunt. They partnered with the BOLO program, short for Be on the Lookout, a social media-driven initiative that helps locate wanted fugitives. A reward of $50,000 was offered to anyone who provided information leading to the arrest of Phuong Thanh Nguyen. With that approach, the suspect's image and wanted notice spread widely across Canadian media. Police believed that with a substantial reward and mounting public pressure, the killer would eventually be caught. While the international manhunt continues, justice at home is being carried out, at least in part. Ricaldo Liebert, the accomplice who helped dispose of the bodies, has been detained and is awaiting court. The investigation into Liebert lasted more than 3 years, as police needed to gather sufficient evidence and wait for the results of the victim search. It was not until early 2025 that the case moved forward, when he unexpectedly pleaded guilty and admitted his role in the disposal. Specifically, on January 7, 2025, at the Newmarket Courthouse in Ontario, Ricaldo Liebert broke down in tears during the hearing when Justice Michelle Furst asked whether he understood the consequences of pleading guilty. After a brief pause to let him regain composure, Liebert chose to plead guilty to 2 counts of interfering with human remains. Under the agreement, Ricaldo Liebert pleaded guilty to those charges in exchange for the withdrawal of more serious allegations related to being an accessory. Prosecutors accepted the deal because their primary objective was to capture the #1 suspect, Phuong Nguyen, so they needed Liebert to cooperate and provide testimony against him. Liebert's statement in court revealed chilling details. On the night of September 18, 2021, Phuong Mike Nguyen called and asked Liebert to drive a truck to the warehouse in Vaughan to pick up a few items. Liebert arrived in a white box truck and backed up to the door of Unit 6. There, he met Phuong and helped load 2 large objects wrapped in black plastic onto the truck, objects that were, in fact, the victims' bodies tightly bound. Then, following Phuong's directions, Liebert drove the cargo to a location a few kilometers from the scene, where a large dumpster was placed, and dumped both bundles inside. Liebert also admitted he deliberately looked the other way, asking no questions about the cargo, despite understanding that something was wrong. After disposing of it, he drove home, ending the job Phuong had hired him to do. This guilty plea aligned with evidence police had collected, closing the chapter on Liebert's role in the case. For the defense, Liebert's lawyer argued mitigating factors such as the fact that he did not kill anyone directly, had no prior criminal record, and had cooperated by pleading guilty. However, prosecutors still emphasized the moral depravity of ignoring a crime of such severity. Liebert is currently out on release while awaiting sentencing in late 2025. Under Canadian law, interfering with human remains can carry a maximum sentence of 5 years per count. It is likely Liebert will receive a sentence of several years for each count, and possibly a portion served on probation if the court gives weight to mitigating circumstances. The more than 3 years he spent in custody may also be credited toward his sentence, significantly reducing how much additional time he must serve behind bars. As for Phuong Thanh Nguyen, if he is arrested and extradited to Canada, he will face 2 charges of first-degree murder, the most serious offense in Canada's legal system, with a punishment that can be life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Notably, Christy Nguyen and Quoc Trun's families have closely followed the legal process for the past 4 years, even though nothing can undo the loss of their loved ones. They expressed relief that Liebert pleaded guilty, viewing it as the first step toward justice. Still, they continue to ache for the day the killer is punished and for Christie's remains to be found so she can be laid to rest properly. The family's lawyer said that once Phuong's trial takes place, they will ask the court to impose the harshest possible sentence as an example, because this was a brutal crime that caused profound, irreparable emotional harm to those left behind. In short, an investigation spanning more than 4 years has achieved partial results. The accomplice's role has been clarified, and he will pay a legal price. Yet the alleged mastermind, Phuong Thanh Nguyen, remains missing. York Regional Police have stated they will not stop pursuing him and will continue working with international partners to bring him before the courts. Next is detailed information about Phuong Thanh Nguyen, the alleged mastermind of this case. Please pay close attention and see whether you might be able to help bring the truth into the light. Phuong Thanh Nguyen is now 37 years old and had been living in Toronto. He is also Vietnamese-Canadian and is often called Mike. Public information about Phuong Nguyen is relatively limited. He is not biologically related to the victims, but he did know them beforehand. Some sources say Phuong had business dealings with Quoc Truong, possibly as a customer buying gardening equipment, or as someone involved in a business partnership. In terms of physical description, Phuong Nguyen is about 1.75 meters tall, weighs 82 kilograms, has an average build, short black hair, and brown eyes. Before the crime, Phuong had no criminal record and had never appeared in York Regional Police files for any serious offenses. It is possible he lived under the cover of an ordinary person, quiet, low profile, and not drawing attention. However, the fact that he allegedly planned a targeted killing suggests Phuong was cold and calculating. He brought a gun to meet the victims, a clear sign the intent to kill was premeditated. After killing the 2 victims, he calmly arranged the disposal and prepared to flee the country within just a few days. This behavior shows an unusual level of composure and method for someone supposedly committing a first major crime. For more than 4 years on the run, Phuong has seemingly vanished without a trace. Police believe he may have financial resources or is receiving significant assistance to remain hidden. Investigators have also warned that Phuong Thanh Nguyen is believed to be armed and dangerous, so the public should never approach him directly if he is spotted. The motive behind Phuong's decision to commit the crime remains a major question mark. Without a statement from the killer, authorities have not been able to announce an official conclusion. However, multiple theories have been raised, including business disputes or financial debt, personal or romantic conflict, or even links to criminal activities such as trafficking illegal substances or laundering money through business operations. Given the context, the most likely scenario may be a dispute over money or business interests. Quoc's Ultra Garden Supply operated in the cultivation equipment sector, an industry that is sometimes exploited to support cannabis grows, which can be extremely profitable in Canada. And it cannot be ruled out that Phuong Thanh Nguyen was connected to some kind of operation and ended up in conflict with Quoc. It is also possible Phuong resented Quoc's success or that a personal grudge had been building over time. Whatever the specific motive was, the brutality of how he carried it out suggests a deep-seated hatred and a clear criminal intent, far beyond an ordinary impulsive act. The killing of the couple, Quoc Truong and Christy Nguyen, sent shock waves across Canada, especially within the Vietnamese community in the Greater Toronto Area. Local and national media covered the case non-stop, from the initial missing person search to the moment it was confirmed as a serious homicide. People were stunned by the sheer brutality and the killer's calculated methods. Many expressed profound grief for the young couple. They had a bright future ahead, so their deaths left everyone heartbroken. On social media, hundreds of condolences were sent to the victims' families. Friends and acquaintances reposted cherished memories of Christy and Quoc and prayed that they would rest in peace in another world. The families of the 2 victims suffered an overwhelming shock. Parents lost their children, siblings lost someone they loved dearly, and plans for a joyful wedding suddenly turned into a funeral. Most painfully, Christy's body still has not been found, leaving an unending ache. In a letter to police, Christy's mother wrote, "For many days we still couldn't believe she was gone. How can this be? Why were all of Christy's dreams and ambitions taken away in just one day?" Quoc Truong's family was the same. He was a devoted son, the pride of his family, and his death left a void that can never be filled. Early one morning in November 2025, federal agents simultaneously raided the private residence of former NYPD officer Andrew Nguyen. a quiet home tucked inside a peaceful neighborhood that appeared completely ordinary. Yet only minutes after entering, agents were stunned by what they found. The entire house was essentially an armory. Weapons, ammunition, and evidence linked to criminal activity were hidden in a highly organized manner. On the kitchen counter, investigators found a loaded Glock 19 with hollow point rounds ammunition, often banned due to its devastating impact. Inside a storage closet, they seized two AR-15 style semi-automatic rifles, along with a customized short-barrel rifle. There was also a large drum magazine loaded with 60 rounds and numerous other ammunition boxes scattered throughout the house. Among this arsenal, investigators also found Nguyen's NYPD nameplate and parking access card. In addition, multiple electronic devices and Nguyen's phones were confiscated for further analysis. The scene left even veteran agents shaking their heads in disbelief, muttering, "We really raised a snake in our own sleeve." What led to this raid, given that Andrew Nguyen had once served alongside them? It turned out that since 2023, after detecting multiple irregularities, authorities had suspected Nguyen of involvement in drug trafficking activities and quietly placed him under surveillance. They began gathering evidence and tracing cases he had handled in the past. From there, investigators discovered that he had queried the names of several drug trafficking suspects unrelated to his assigned cases. This was clear proof that Nguyen was accessing internal databases for personal purposes. Authorities also secretly monitored his bank account. Over several years, multiple cash deposits totaling more than $30,000 were made into this account, with no legitimate source recorded. For someone with the steady income of a police officer, this suspicious flow of money immediately became a major red flag. To obtain evidence strong enough for prosecution, federal agents decided to set a trap and catch him in the act. They used an undercover agent to approach Nguyen and the individuals he protected, referred to as CC1-inch the case files. The plan was as follows. The undercover agent would pose as a new drug dealer and ask CC1 to hire Nguyen to transport 5 kilograms of illegal drugs from the Bronx to Queens for an attractive price. As expected, Nguyen immediately agreed when he learned that successfully delivering the 5 kilograms would earn him $5,000. The transaction was arranged at a secluded meeting point. Nguyen arrived in his personal vehicle, carrying his firearm and police badge as he usually did. At the meeting spot, the undercover agent handed Nguyen a suitcase containing 5 fake packages of product, while Nguyen handed over a symbolic payment to complete the deal. The entire exchange was captured clearly by hidden cameras from multiple angles. Nguyen appeared calm and efficient, clear signs that this was far from the first time he had done such a thing. And this recording marked the end of the criminal path he had been following for years. Investigators did not stop there. They used multiple investigative techniques to strengthen the case. They tracked GPS data from Nguyen's vehicle and phone to match his movements with suspicious locations, and they analyzed traffic camera footage to determine whether Nguyen's patrol car had been near drug-related locations at unusual times. Piece by piece, each clue fit into place, forming a complete case file revealing the systematic misconduct of a police officer once trusted by the public. After gathering sufficient evidence, prosecutors launched the operation to raid Nguyen's home in 2025, as previously described. From the moment Andrew Nguyen was arrested, the judicial machinery moved swiftly. Notably, when investigators reviewed data on Nguyen's phone, they found a message showing that right after he was fired from the NYPD for an unrelated violation in late 2023, he shamelessly expressed interest in working for a drug trafficking kingpin. This blunt message was considered a form of self-incrimination, proving Nguyen was fully willing to abandon his role as a former officer for money. During interrogation, knowing he could no longer avoid responsibility, Andrew Nguyen admitted part of his actions in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. He described in detail everything he had done, from transporting drugs while armed, to staging fake arrests, to accessing confidential databases and providing information to the drug lord. Nguyen also admitted that carrying his gun and badge was not for self-defense as regulations require, but to facilitate the drug trafficking operation. With the recorded confession and the extensive case file previously collected, the federal investigation finally came to an end after a long and arduous process. So what exactly caused a seemingly dedicated officer to spiral into wrongdoing? Let's look back at his background for answers. Andrew Nguyen, 41 years old, was a Vietnamese-American born and raised in the New York area. He began his career with the NYPD around 2005 or 2006, assigned to the Transit Bureau, the division responsible for public transportation security. For most of his service, Nguyen worked in Transit District 12 inches the Bronx. The assignment was far from easy, as the Bronx has long been an area with high crime rates, and patrolling the subway system meant confronting incidents of all kinds, big and small, every single day. According to his colleagues, Nguyen was energetic, knowledgeable about the local area, and unafraid of danger. On the surface, he appeared to be a dedicated officer ready to protect the community. However, even early in his career, signs of ethical misconduct began to emerge. According to investigative documents, between 2008 and 2009, he secretly collaborated with a drug trafficker. This individual was CC1, an old acquaintance from before Nguyen joined the force. During that period, Nguyen abused his position to share confidential information about rival gangs with CC1. Not only that, he even appeared at certain meetings of the group as protection, always carrying his firearm, an act that violated police protocol entirely. When his colleagues were preparing to conduct raids in specific areas, Nguyen quietly tipped off his partners so they could escape beforehand. The most serious incident occurred when CC1 was arrested during a surprise inspection at a warehouse. Instead of supporting his team and following procedure, Nguyen secretly removed part of the seized evidence to destroy it. This was considered extremely serious misconduct, interfering with an active investigation to protect criminals. After that event, Nguyen seemed to lay low for a long period. Over the next 10 years, he continued working and was promoted through seniority, eventually becoming one of the veteran officers of Transit District 12. But by 2020, possibly due to financial strain during the pandemic, Andrew Nguyen returned to the criminal path. He proactively contacted his old friend, who by then had become a drug trafficking kingpin and needed an insider within the police department. Their reunion marked the beginning of Nguyen's second downfall, even more severe than the first. From 2020 to 2023, as mentioned earlier, he received more than $30,000 for providing protection and transporting drugs for the organization. To avoid suspicion for such a long time, Andrew Nguyen took full advantage of his professional knowledge and authority. Each time he transported shipments, he carried his NYPD-issued handgun. Not only that, he kept his police badge and parking access card with him to avoid drawing suspicion from patrol units or being subjected to random checks. Beyond physically transporting drugs, Nguyen also acted as an undercover bodyguard for the kingpin. On many occasions, he served as the driver for CC1 during important transactions. His presence acted as a silent warning. Anyone attempting to interfere risked being handled by a police officer on the spot. Thus, the public authority he once held became twisted into a shield for criminals. More dangerously, Nguyen exploited the internal database system of the New York Police Department to aid the drug operation. Using his officer-level access, he secretly searched for classified information such as home addresses, criminal records, and active investigations targeting CC1's rivals, then leaked all this information so the kingpin could prepare countermeasures. On one occasion, Nguyen even offered to personally arrest a competing dealer of CC1 to clear the way, as long as he was paid accordingly. Had this plan been executed, it would have represented the peak of corruption. A police officer using his authority to arrest someone not for justice, but for payment from criminals. Shockingly, Nguyen even staged fake arrests to serve the drug ring's schemes. In early 2021, CC1 fell into heavy debt after losing a shipment of marijuana belonging to a distribution partner. To save his friend from that massive debt, Nguyen devised a plan to pretend to stop CC1's vehicle on the street, confiscate all the drugs and cash he was carrying, and make it appear like a legitimate bust. Thanks to this staged incident, CC1 had a legitimate excuse to tell his supplier that the drugs and cash had been confiscated by police. As a result, the debt was effectively erased, while Nguyen pocketed about $10,000 as a reward for pulling off the deception. But it didn't stop there. Andrew Nguyen was already entertaining even darker schemes if the price was right. According to case files, he once suggested kidnapping 2 debtors of another drug kingpin, referred to as CC2, pretending it was a lawful arrest before handing them over to CC2 for punishment. Fortunately, this police impersonation kidnapping plot was never carried out. Similarly, Nguyen, CC1, and another associate known as CC3 even discussed robbing a cash courier involved in drug transactions by staging a fake traffic stop. Although these plans were never executed, the mere intention revealed that Andrew Nguyen had lost every remaining sense of moral boundaries. Many Vietnamese who once knew him were shocked and disappointed to learn he had become a criminal. They remembered him as a quiet man with a family and young children, active in community events. Yet behind their backs, he lived a double life, helping funnel illegal drugs into the very neighborhoods he once promised to protect. For his colleagues at the New York Police Department, Nguyen's downfall was humiliating. An Asian American officer who once passed the rigorous NYPD selection process and served for more than a decade ultimately betrayed his team for dirty money. This story left fellow officers both angry and insulted. From the Vietnamese community to the NYPD ranks, everyone saw Andrew Nguyen's case as a painful lesson about ethics and loyalty. Given the severity of the scandal, the case of Andrew Nguyen was brought directly to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, an institution known for its strict handling of corruption within public service. On November 4th, 2025, a lengthy indictment spanning dozens of pages was publicly released, immediately drawing media attention. In the defendant's seat, Andrew Nguyen appeared in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. He only lifted his head once when the judge called his name, then spent the rest of the hearing staring downward, avoiding all eye contact. The federal indictment detailed how Andrew Nguyen had severely violated the duties of a police officer, beginning with the charge of honest services fraud. This charge alleged that he exploited his public position for personal gain, betraying the responsibility to serve the community. It is a charge commonly used for corrupt public officials and carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. Accompanying this was the charge of conspiracy to commit honest services fraud, indicating that Nguyen did not act alone but colluded with multiple individuals to undermine the proper function of government agencies. Under these charges, defendants can face a maximum sentence of 20 years. Additionally, the indictment showed that Nguyen had repeatedly accepted or solicited illicit payments totaling more than $30,000 to overlook or assist criminal operations. This bribery was described as a serious attack on the integrity of law enforcement, and under federal law, such conduct can carry up to 10 years in prison. However, this was only the surface of his violations. The most serious charge in the case was conspiracy to distribute more than 5 kilograms of illegal drugs. Under federal regulations, this drug quantity alone automatically triggers a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. If prosecutors could prove that Nguyen held a significant role in transporting or protecting the drug shipments, the maximum sentence could reach life in prison. The fact that a former police officer was involved in such conduct made the case even more severe in the eyes of the court and the public. Additionally, Nguyen was charged with using his service weapon to assist and protect drug-related activities. This is a very serious federal offense. The minimum penalty for this charge is 5 years in prison, to be served consecutively to any other sentences, not concurrently. With aggravating factors, the sentence could also reach life imprisonment. Lastly, the indictment included the charge of conspiracy to commit robbery, as Nguyen and his associates had discussed staging a police-style traffic stop to rob a cash courier from a drug operation. Even though the plan was never executed, the act of planning and showing clear intent was enough to constitute a federal crime, as it impacted interstate commerce. The maximum penalty for this offense is also 20 years. Looking at the case as a whole, if convicted of all charges, Andrew Nguyen could face decades in prison, possibly even life. The 2 drug-related charges alone carry a mandatory minimum of 20 years. Adding the mandatory 5 years for the firearm charge means Nguyen would face at least 25 years. The remaining charges could be ordered to run concurrently, but by any calculation, the final sentence would be unlikely to fall below 25 to 30 years. In reality, given that the federal system offers very limited sentence reductions, Nguyen may remain incarcerated until old age. During the hearing, his defense attorney offered little substantive rebuttal to the allegations, instead requesting that Nguyen be released on bail for a reasonable amount. He argued that Nguyen had a long service record, a family, and no prior criminal history, and therefore did not pose a flight risk. However, the judge sided with prosecutors and maintained the bail amount at $400,000. This sum exceeded Nguyen's immediate ability to pay, meaning he would remain in custody while awaiting his next court dates. The case of former Officer Andrew Nguyen concluded but left behind heavy consequences and profound lessons for both law enforcement and the broader community. First and foremost, it delivered a major blow to the trust New Yorkers placed in their police force. In recent years, tensions between police and the public had already been strained due to incidents involving excessive force and allegations of discrimination. Learning that an officer had participated in a drug trafficking network only deepened public unease and disappointment. When the scandal involving Andrew Nguyen came to light, the Vietnamese community in New York was also deeply shaken. The reason is simple. Very few members of the community have ever joined the police force, so each Vietnamese-American officer in a blue uniform had long been considered a source of pride. Yet now, Andrew Nguyen being exposed for his involvement in criminal activity felt like a bucket of cold water poured directly onto the trust the community once placed in him. For the New York Police Department, this case was a painful wake-up call. Although NYPD leadership emphasized that this was merely one bad apple and that the vast majority of officers remained dedicated and honest, they also had to admit that gaps existed within their internal oversight system. The lingering question troubling many was, how could an officer deceive the entire department for 3 years or possibly longer without detection? This revealed that the mechanisms for identifying corruption within the force truly required serious reevaluation. After the Andrew Nguyen scandal, it became clear that NYPD would need to tighten numerous protocols to close these loopholes. Oversight of internal database access would undoubtedly become stricter. Surprise financial audits for employees might be conducted more frequently. And mechanisms encouraging officers to report suspicious behavior would likely be strengthened. In fact, Andrew Nguyen's indictment was circulated widely within the department as a stark reminder that corruption in any form would not be tolerated. On a broader scale, the scandal also reignited a long-standing societal concern, the phenomenon of police officers falling into criminal behavior. In the United States, police are granted significant power to maintain order, but that very power can be a double-edged sword. If a police officer becomes corrupt, the harm he causes is far greater than that of an ordinary criminal, because he understands how the system operates, knows where its weaknesses lie, and most importantly, possesses privileges that make wrongdoing easier. In reality, the issue of police walking hand in hand with criminals is not new. American history has witnessed entire eras marked by widespread police corruption, such as during the Knapp Commission and Mullen Commission. However, today's context is vastly different. Surveillance technologies are more advanced, public expectations for ethical conduct are higher, and demands for transparency are stronger. Therefore, although cases like that of Andrew Nguyen are rare, they create exceptional scandal and cast a long shadow over the image of honest officers who work tirelessly to keep the public safe. On January 1st, 2009, while many families were gathering around New Year's meals, the calm of Calgary was suddenly shattered by a horrific shooting. At Bolsa Restaurant, a well-known Vietnamese eatery in the city's southeast, a series of deafening shots erupted from the back tables, sending customers and staff into panic. Some screamed and searched for cover, while others pushed past one another to escape. A few witnesses quickly called 911 to report the shooting. Just minutes later, patrol cars and ambulances rushed to the scene. When they entered the restaurant, paramedics and investigators were immediately overwhelmed by the chaos before them. The sharp smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Shattered glass was scattered across the floor, tables and chairs were overturned, and 3 blood-soaked bodies lay motionless on the ground. 2 victims were lying close together near the dining area, while the third collapsed right at the doorway, his body stretched out as if he had been shot while trying to run. Marks on the glass frame suggested that at least 1 bullet had pierced through. Nearby, investigators recovered more than a dozen shell casings, indicating that multiple gunmen were involved and that the attack was carried out with frightening brutality. During the crime scene examination, one investigator suddenly noticed a tattoo of 5 small dots arranged in a pentagon on the back of one victim's hand. It was a familiar symbol in Asian gang circles, representing 5 tons: love, money, prison, crime, and vengeance. That discovery raised a chilling suspicion. Could this have been a bloody gang-related retaliation? Police also recovered several other key leads. Security camera footage from the parking lot showed the faint outline of a suspicious vehicle leaving the scene immediately after the shooting, with at least 2 people inside. All these details began to suggest a scenario involving a group of professional hitmen, people who had carefully prepared for their brutal plan. At first, the investigative team faced significant difficulty identifying the victims because 2 of the 3 were not carrying any identification. However, after comparing fingerprints and conducting facial identification, they determined that one of the 3 was Sanjeev Mann, 22 years old. Mann was born and raised in Calgary in a South Asian family. Yet he had close ties with many Vietnamese youths living in the city's northeast. Mann's teenage years quickly veered onto the wrong path when he dropped out of school and joined the FK gang, becoming an eager soldier in its conflict with the rival FOB gang. According to associates, Mann was reckless and loyal and had survived multiple prior confrontations. Based on the information gathered, investigators began to suspect that the primary target of the shooting may have been Sanjeev Mann. Not long before, Roger Chin, a prominent member of the FOB gang, had been killed in a shooting in Calgary. Police believe Mann's killing was likely retaliation by FOB for Roger Chin's death, since Mann was aligned with FK-FOB's direct rival in the city's underworld struggle for power and respect. The second victim was identified as Aaron Bendel, 21 years old, believed to be Mann's friend or associate within the gang circle. Bendel did not have a serious criminal record. However, he had previously been suspected of involvement in small-scale drug dealing. His body was found right next to Mann's, indicating the 2 had been together at the moment of the attack. The man who collapsed near the entrance was identified as Kenny Su'a, in his 30s. The investigation found that he had no ties to any gangs and had only happened to be at the restaurant for a New Year's lunch, before tragically becoming an unintended victim in the deadly shooting. The investigation into the massacre at Bolsa restaurant was often described as a nerve-wracking battle between police and the criminal underworld. From the earliest days, the task force assessed that this was not an isolated homicide, but a link in an escalating chain of violence between 2 notorious gangs, FOB and FK. As the scene suggested, every trace pointed to a targeted assassination. The bullet impacts were concentrated where Mann and Bendel had been seated, showing the shooters had aimed with precision and were not firing randomly. The number of shell casings recovered, along with the firing angles, indicated that at least 2 handguns were used simultaneously. The first key lead emerged when police analyzed a phone found on Mann. Technicians discovered that on the night of December 31st, 2008, just before the attack, Mann's phone received multiple missed calls and messages from Aaron Bendel's number. It appeared Bendel had been reaching out to arrange a meeting with Mann at lunchtime the next day, the fateful moment that led to the massacre that shook Calgary. This discovery raised a major suspicion among investigators. Could Aaron Bendel have acted as bait, luring Mann to that fateful meeting point? To clarify, police traced Bendel's phone number and requested his full call history from the carrier. The results showed that on the morning of January 1st, 2009, there were dozens of unusual short calls from Bendel's phone to many different numbers, each lasting only a few dozen seconds. This could indicate that the suspects coordinated a rapid operation, using Bendel as bait to pinpoint Mann's location before striking. Meanwhile, specialized detectives quickly compiled a list of FOB gang members who could have been involved. Prominent on that list were Nathan Zuccarado, 25 years old, and Michael Roberto, 28 years old, 2 notorious reckless gunmen under Nick Chan, who was widely seen as FOB's top leader. According to underworld rumors at the time, FOB even offered a hot bounty of 10,000 Canadian dollars for anyone who could take down a member of FK. To narrow the investigation, police pulled all traffic camera footage around the restaurant area. One recording showed that just minutes after the shooting, a dark-colored sedan sped away from the scene at high speed. Following the vehicle's route, police discovered it abandoned in a garage in a suburban area. Inside, the car still carried the smell of gunpowder, along with a few small bloodstains, further reinforcing the theory that it had been the hit team's getaway vehicle. However, the sedan was quickly confirmed to be stolen, leaving investigators at a dead end when it came to identifying the true owner. Even so, during the forensic examination, police found a faint fingerprint on the steering wheel. A rapid analysis indicated a partial match to Real Christian Honorio, a close associate of Nathan Zuccarotto and Michael Roberto within FOB. This was the first time investigators were able to tie a specific suspect to the massacre scene, providing a legal basis to move forward with arrests. But even with substantial circumstantial evidence, police still needed a direct witness to accurately reconstruct the full sequence of events. Yet an atmosphere of fear hung over the case, and most people who had been at the restaurant that day refused to cooperate. Many gave only minimal statements and avoided details, and police suspected that some of them recognized the shooters but chose to stay silent out of fear of retaliation. Months later, a turning point finally came when a mysterious individual identifying themselves as M proactively contacted police, offering information in exchange for protection. In the statement, MM asserted that Nathan Zuccarotto, Michael Roberto, and Real Christian Honorio were the ones who planned and carried out the shooting at Bolsa restaurant. MM also admitted to being at the scene as the getaway driver. Notably, the details MM provided matched almost perfectly with independent evidence police had already collected, finally revealing a crucial missing piece of the case. Alongside MM's testimony, police expanded the investigation by obtaining location data from the suspect's phones during the time window of the attack. The results showed that the signals for both Nathan Zuccarotto and Michael Roberto appeared near Bolsa restaurant around midday on January 1st, 2009, even though both had previously claimed they were at home all day. This discovery undermined the credibility of their statements and further strengthened investigators' suspicions. Not long afterward, the task force received another report from Saskatchewan Provincial Police about a traffic stop that took place in July 2009. Notably, the vehicle that had been pulled over for a violation included M, the person who would later become a confidential witness in the Bolsa case. During the conversation, MM blurted out and bragged that he had taken care of all three guys at Bolsa. Those words were inadvertently recorded by a Saskatchewan officer. However, for reasons unknown, the recording was left sitting in a file for a long time before it was eventually forwarded to Calgary investigators. When they listened to it, detectives were stunned. It turned out that MM was not only a witness, he could also have been one of the people directly involved in the shooting. This created an extremely delicate situation because MM was already under protection and had been promised immunity as long as he had not personally fired the shots during the massacre. In the end, after many rounds of tense negotiations, police reached an agreement with Make. If he agreed to cooperate and testify against Nathan Zuccarotto, Michael Roberto, and Real Honorio, he would not be prosecuted in connection with the Bolsa massacre. At the same time, through investigative measures, authorities also verified that MM was not the person who directly shot the three victims, despite his earlier bragging. It is very possible he was simply boasting to look tough, or he was intoxicated at the time of the stop. In parallel, a review of communication data produced another key piece of evidence. Honorio's phone number matched one of the numbers that had placed a short call to Aaron Bendel on the night before the attack. This discovery was like the final hammer blow, confirming that the FOB hit team led by Zuccarotto were the true perpetrators behind the massacre. Soon after, Alberta prosecutors approved emergency arrest warrants for all three suspects. In the early morning hours of August 25th, 2009, tactical teams simultaneously raided each suspect's residence. At an apartment in downtown Calgary, police arrested Nathan Zuccarotto while he was still asleep and seized a handgun along with body armor. At the same time, Michael Roberto was taken into custody at his girlfriend's home in northern Calgary. He attempted to jump out a window to escape, but it was too late. As for Real Honorio, when police surrounded his parents' home in Saskatoon, he voluntarily surrendered. News of the arrests was quickly announced, allowing Calgary residents to breathe a sigh of relief after months of anxiety and tension. The three men behind the Bolsa restaurant massacre were all young adults, born and raised in Canada. Yet they were pulled into a criminal spiral by the lure of gangs and the desire to prove themselves in the underworld. Nathan Zuccarotto, 25 years old, a Canadian of European descent, was one of the key members of the FOB gang. He grew up in Calgary, dropped out of school early, and had been arrested multiple times for weapons possession. With his tall build, aggressive temper, and habit of carrying a gun, Zuccardo quickly gained the trust of Nick Chan, FOB's leader, and was given major responsibilities. He viewed FK members as sworn enemies after one of his brothers in the gang was attacked in a territorial war. Michael Roberto, 28 years old, was also from Calgary. Roberto joined FOB around the same time as Zuccardo and soon became well known in criminal circles for his recklessness and nerve. He had taken part in multiple fights, assaults against rival gang members, and had a record involving small-scale possession of illegal substances. The youngest of the group was Real Christian Honorio, 26 years old, of Filipino heritage. Honorio joined FOB as a new recruit and always saw Zuccardo and Roberto as role models to follow. Driven by a hunger for recognition in the underworld, he was willing to do anything to prove himself. And in the end, that ambition led Honorio down a road with no way out. Before they were caught, Zuccardo was considered FOB's primary shooter, someone who did not hesitate to use a gun to settle conflict. Roberto was his closest ally, often working with him on jobs assigned by the gang. Honorio initially served as a lookout and support, but was also ready to act when needed. None of the three had a personal relationship with Sanjeev Man. They saw him only as an enemy target that had to be eliminated. Some sources claim that Nick Chan ordered Man to be taken out at all costs, and after a period of surveillance, they chose to strike on January 1st, 2009, when the victim would be least on guard. That morning, the hit team divided roles with cold calculation. Honorio instructed Bendel to call and invite Man to Bolsa, a familiar Vietnamese restaurant, creating the perfect trap. When Man and Bendel walked in, Honorio went along to avoid drawing attention, while Zuccardo and Roberto were already lying in wait outside with weapons in hand, ready for the moment to move. Around midday, the restaurant door suddenly swung open. Zuccardo and Roberto rushed in, drew their guns, and fired straight at the table where Man was sitting. The first two shots dropped him on the spot. Roberto immediately turned and fired at Bendel as Bendel panicked and tried to stand up to run. In just a few seconds, the two primary targets were taken down amid screaming and chaos from the diners. In that moment, Kenny Sua, an innocent customer, hurried toward the door to escape. Honorio blocked the exit and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Sua in the back, and he collapsed at the threshold, ending any chance of survival. When the gunfire stopped, all three killers retreated exactly as planned. They ran to a waiting vehicle in the parking lot and sped away before police could arrive. The vehicle was later taken to an empty lot on the outskirts, where they burned it along with evidence. The guns were dismantled and thrown into a river to destroy the traces. During their escape, they even called to brag about their work to other associates. Within FOB circles, the Bolsa massacre quickly became a sick point of pride, so much so that some of their friends turned it into a rap verse, glorifying violence and cruelty. Bringing the Bolsa perpetrators into the light of justice was tense and dramatic like a Hollywood courtroom film. After their arrests in 2009, Nathan Zuccardo, Michael Roberto, and Real Honorio all insisted they were innocent, forcing prosecutors to pour everything they had into proving their crimes in court. Throughout the trial, the three defendants remained composed, almost cold, while defense teams focused on attacking the credibility of witnesses and the prosecution's evidence. Alan Hepner, Zuccardo's lawyer, argued that witness MM was unreliable because he had once claimed he was the one who shot all three victims. Kim Ross, representing Roberto, also argued that MM had a motive to lie because police had promised him immunity and paid him 27,000 Canadian dollars in exchange for his cooperation. The defense tried to portray M as an addict and a small-time drug dealer who regularly fabricated stories to avoid responsibility. They also pointed out multiple inconsistencies between MM's testimony and that of another unnamed witness, aiming to undermine the credibility of the entire account. The trial stretched on for weeks under heavy tension. The victims' families, especially Kinisua's ex-wife, attended regularly, quietly shedding tears whenever the moment of her husband's killing was reconstructed in court. In the defendant's row, Zuccardo sometimes displayed a defiant attitude, staring intensely at M as if trying to intimidate him. In contrast, Real Honorio often kept his head down, avoiding the victim's family's eyes, and even broke down when his father said he had lost the good son he once knew. After intense arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Just over 7 hours later, they reached their verdict. On October 17, 2011, the court found Nathan Zuccarotto and Michael Roberto guilty of first-degree murder for all 3 victims. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no parole eligibility for at least 25 years. A few months later, Rio Lenorio's separate trial also concluded. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for Sanjeev Maan and Aaron Bendel, and 1 count of second-degree murder in the case of Kenny Sua because Sua had not been part of the original plan to kill. Honorio also claimed he did not intend to shoot a civilian, but acted without restraint in the chaos. With that ruling, he received a life sentence, with parole eligibility only after serving at least 20 years. However, the case still was not fully over. Defense lawyers refused to accept defeat and quickly filed appeals. They relied on the recorded confession by MM, arguing it was new evidence that could change the nature of the case and the defendants' roles. By mid-2012, the Alberta Court of Appeal overturned the convictions of Nathan Zuccarotto and Michael Roberto, ordering a new trial from the beginning. In 2014, during the retrial, Michael Roberto unexpectedly changed strategy. Facing the risk of a severe conviction or a prolonged legal battle, he agreed to plead guilty under a deal with prosecutors. Roberto admitted he took part in the Bolsa restaurant massacre and had his sentence reduced to 16 years in prison. In return, he agreed to cooperate and provide information related to other FOB cases, helping authorities continue their crackdown on the organization. Not long after, Rio Lenorio chose a similar path. He agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Kenny Sua in exchange for having the earlier first-degree murder conviction set aside. At his sentencing in 2016, Honorio publicly apologized to the victim's family, expressing belated remorse for his reckless and misguided actions. Nathan Zuccarotto, who was seen as the central mastermind of the massacre, chose silence. By 2016, the Alberta court decided not to hold a new trial for Zuccarotto and instead upheld his life sentence based on independent evidence as well as incriminating testimony from Roberto and Honorio. In that way, after years of investigation and prolonged courtroom battles, all 3 principal perpetrators in the Bolsa massacre received sentences deemed proportional to their crimes. Justice was finally served, even though the legal journey was long, winding, and filled with upheaval. Another notable detail is that the Bolsa case did not end with the 3 men who carried out the shooting. It also led to a separate, high-profile trial targeting the man believed to be the true boss behind it all. In 2013, Nick Chan, a suspect believed to be the leader of the FOB gang, was arrested and charged with allegedly masterminding multiple homicides, including the killing of Sanjeev Maan. However, the proceedings ended in controversy. In 2018, a judge stayed all charges against Nick Chan due to a violation of the right to be tried within a reasonable time, as the case had dragged on far longer than allowed. That ruling disappointed many, because the man believed to be the gang's kingpin walked out of court a free man. Even so, that freedom did not restore his former power. After the case, FOB largely collapsed. Some of Nick Chan's close associates were killed, and others gradually ended up behind bars. The underworld that once terrified Calgary was reduced to remnants of the past. After the trials concluded, Calgary slowly regained its sense of peace after nearly a decade overshadowed by violence. The bloody war between FOB and FK officially ended as most leaders and key gunmen on both sides were either dead or serving prison sentences. According to statistics, from 2002 to 2009, there were more than 25 homicides directly linked to this conflict. Yet only 2 cases were solved during that period due to the gang's secrecy and brutality. It was not until the early 2010s, through a series of major cases and large-scale trials, that Calgary police were able to fully shut down the 2 notorious criminal organizations. After this upheaval, the city's police force restructured its specialized units, increasing staffing and equipment to strengthen its ability to combat organized crime. At the same time, outreach programs within immigrant communities were expanded, aiming to help teenagers stay away from gangs and move toward healthier paths in society. The Bolsa Vietnamese restaurant massacre and the bloody war between FOB and FK became a long-running focus of Canadian media for many years, fueling public outrage and anxiety. Many residents criticized police for allowing a series of killings to continue without being fully contained. Vietnamese and other Asian communities in Calgary also face stigma, viewed with suspicion after multiple gang-related incidents. Later, Canadian media organizations drew lessons from that period, reporting more carefully and more balancedly to avoid misunderstandings or racial bias. Even though the direct perpetrators were punished, most of the homicides tied to the gang war still remain unsolved. More than 20 victim families, many of them also connected to the criminal world, still do not know exactly why their loved ones were killed. And the question that haunts many the most is this: behind bars, did people like Nathan Zuccarotto or Real Honorio truly come to their senses? Or do old grudges still smolder inside them, waiting for a chance to be repaid? On Friday morning, the 21st of June 2024, at approximately 8:52 a.m., the York Region 911 dispatch received multiple urgent calls reporting gunshots at a home on Casanova Drive in Woodbridge, Canada. Shocked neighbors recounted hearing several loud bangs in succession, shattering the quiet of the residential street. Less than 5 minutes later, patrol units from the York Regional Police and paramedics arrived with sirens blaring. Rapid response teams quickly secured the scene, attempting to determine whether the gunman was still nearby. Behind the door of the house, a horrifying scene unfolded. 4 victims were found collapsed in different rooms, blood pooling across the floors. Among them was a 2-year-old boy lying motionless in a woman's arms, and 2 other adults, 1 male, 1 female, critically injured. Paramedics immediately began emergency treatment. However, they quickly realized 1 victim had already died before the ambulance arrived. The remaining 3 were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but 1 succumbed shortly afterward due to the severity of the injuries. Though chaotic, the scene was swiftly brought under control once detectives from the York Regional Homicide Unit arrived. They quickly conducted brief interviews with neighbors, many of whom were still trembling as they spoke. All reported hearing a man screaming in rage, mixed with a child's cries, just before the gunshots erupted. The case showed clear signs of being targeted, not random. Investigators established a security perimeter around the Casanova Drive home and began processing the scene. Thankfully, the victims' identities were quickly confirmed through documents found at the scene and the accounts of nearby residents. Police soon learned the house belonged to Tu Vu, 41, and his wife Do Thi Trang, 40. The 2-year-old boy who died was their youngest son, Marcus Vu. The other severely injured adult was Vu's mother, who had been living with the couple to help care for the children. The luckiest of all was the couple's 4-year-old son, who had been home during the attack but managed to hide and avoided being shot. When officers arrived, the frightened boy was found curled inside a closet, unharmed. The tragedy became even more heartbreaking as people learned more about the victims' lives. Do Thi Trang, 40, was remembered by family and friends as a gentle, educated, and devoted woman. Born in Vietnam, she immigrated to Canada with her family when she was a child. She graduated in accounting and once worked for Microsoft, but in recent years, she transitioned into real estate to pursue her passion for communication and helping others. According to James Tew, Trang's half-brother, she was introverted by nature but extremely dedicated to her new career, earning the full trust of her clients. Friends described her as the perfect mother, kind-hearted and always putting her husband and children first. At the time of the attack, Trang had taken some time off to stay home more and care for her 2 young children. Marcus Vu, 2 years old, the youngest son, was a cheerful toddler with an adorable smile that made everyone instantly love him. Marcus especially loved the color red. He had a red Toronto Raptors cap that he wore everywhere, treating it as his treasured item. In nearly every family photo on social media, Marcus could be seen with his red cap and bright smile. The tragedy struck just as Marcus had begun speaking his first innocent words. He never had the chance to grow up and explore the world before his life was cruelly taken. Tu Vu. Trang's husband survived, but now carries unimaginable grief. Vu, also of Vietnamese origin, immigrated to Canada and built his life there. Friends said he worked as an IT engineer for a company in Toronto. As the family's pillar, Vu adored his wife and children. On the morning of the incident, he was at home helping his wife prepare breakfast for the kids. The investigation revealed he was shot twice, once in the shoulder and once grazing his abdomen, yet he still attempted to confront the shooter to stop him. Even so, he was forced to witness the deaths of his wife and child, a trauma that will likely haunt him for the rest of his life. The family also had a 4-year-old son. He was unharmed thanks to Vu quickly pushing him into a hiding spot. The child is now being cared for by his grandparents. His innocence brought many to tears. He kept asking, "Where are mommy and my brother? Why is everyone crying?" The tragedy took his loving mother and baby brother away and turned his father into a widower. The Vietnamese communities in Toronto and Vaughan were devastated by the family's loss. Known for their gentle personalities and lack of any social conflicts, Trang and little Marcus were entirely innocent victims. Even their home was located in a safe neighborhood, far from any crime, hotspots. Therefore, the question, why was this family targeted, continued to haunt the public. Friends and neighbors confirmed that the couple lived harmoniously, held no grudges against anyone, and had no ties to gangs or illegal activity. The motive clearly did not come from the victim's side. It had to be uncovered from the perpetrator. Once Tu Vu was stable enough to speak, he immediately provided police with a critical detail. The shooter was someone close to the family. His name was Van Viet Duong, 41, a Toronto resident. Records confirmed that Van Viet Duong, also known as Chris Duong, indeed had prior ties to the Vu family. He had visited their home several times. According to Vu, Duong had been a business acquaintance for years, as close as family. The fact that Duong showed up only to slaughter the household left Vu in shock, repeatedly saying, "This makes no sense." So what could drive a man who was warmly welcomed into the home, a trusted friend, to commit such cruelty? This became the biggest knot investigators needed to untangle. First, police examined the possibility of accomplices. As some evidence suggested, the shooter might not have acted alone. However, based on Vu's testimony and ballistic evidence showing only one type of shell casing, the possibility of multiple shooters was ruled out. This appeared to be the act of a lone gunman. Still, investigators broadened their inquiry to determine whether Duong had been encouraged or assisted by anyone. Cell tower data showed that at 8:45 a.m. on June 21, Duong's phone pinged a tower near Casanova Drive, placing him at the crime scene at the exact time of the attack. After 9 a.m., his phone signal disappeared, likely because he turned it off. But highway cameras on Highway 400 captured a speeding black Toyota around 9:15 a.m. with a license plate matching Duong vehicle. This confirmed his escape route. He fled Vaughan immediately after the shooting. Investigators then dug into Duong's criminal background. What they found made them frown. Duong had a record and was actively wanted. In January 2024, he had been arrested by the Ontario Provincial Police for assaulting an officer and dangerous driving. He had rammed his vehicle into an OPP officer while fleeing on Highway 410 inches Brampton. Duong was charged with multiple offenses: dangerous driving, assaulting a police officer, fleeing the scene, stunt driving, and possession of prohibited items. However, after his initial court appearance, he was released on bail pending trial. In early June 2024, he failed to appear at one of his scheduled hearings, prompting the court to issue a warrant for his arrest. Thus, at the time of the shooting, Duong was already a wanted fugitive for violating bail conditions. The fact that a dangerous offender with such a history was freely roaming raised questions about systemic weaknesses and helped police better understand his volatility. Knowing the suspect was familiar with the victims, investigators revisited the crime scene and his past connections to search for motive. A significant clue emerged. The Casanova home had been the target of a mysterious arson attack 6 months earlier. In the early hours of the 25th of December 2023 Christmas Day, security cameras captured an unknown individual pouring gasoline and setting fire to the Vu family's Tesla and pickup truck. The perpetrator escaped on an electric scooter. No one was injured, but the case had remained unsolved. Now, police suspected a direct link between the Christmas arson and the shooting. It was highly likely that Duong set the fire but failed to harm anyone, then returned months later to finish what he started. Duong's phone data from Christmas 2023 also showed he was in the Vaughan area at the time of the arson. Notably, investigators conducted an in-depth interview with Tu Vu once he recovered. Vu recalled that Duong suddenly showed up at his door, saying he wanted to visit the family. Trusting him as a friend, Vu let him inside for a drink. Just minutes later, Duong pulled out a gun and shot Vu's wife, Du Thi Trong, who was carrying little Marcus into the living room. The attack happened so fast that Vu barely had time to react before he was shot and collapsed, hearing more gunshots toward his mother. Duong fired approximately 8 shots and left immediately without saying a word. This detail confirmed Duong's willingness to murder women and children without hesitation. Vu's account aligned perfectly with forensic evidence. This became the key clue that allowed investigators to reconstruct the crime and firmly conclude that the primary suspect was Van Viet Duong. With no doubt remaining, the York Regional Police shifted their full focus onto Duong and moved from identification to manhunt mode. A special arrest warrant for Van Viet Duong was issued on the afternoon of the 21st of June 2024. York Regional Police, in coordination with the Toronto Police Service (TPS), identified several locations where Duong might hide, including his residence in North York and several addresses belonging to friends and relatives. The emergency response unit was also mobilized due to the risk that the suspect was armed and dangerous. On the evening of June 21, around 8 p.m., police located Duong, black Toyota, parked inside his home garage in the Jane and Finch area of Toronto. Dozens of officers quietly surrounded the neighborhood. Loudspeakers called for him to surrender, but there was no response. The tactical unit then breached the door. Completely caught off guard, Duong had no chance to resist. He was arrested in his bedroom, unarmed. When handcuffed, Duong remained silent with his head down. A search of the home uncovered a black hoodie printed with the number 3 on the sleeve and a black baseball cap with the letter P, matching the description of the arson suspect seen in the video. Additionally, an electric scooter identical to the one used in the incident was found in the garage. These items were immediately sent for forensic testing to determine whether Duong was involved in the Christmas arson. Regarding weapons, police recovered a Glock 19 handgun and loaded magazine hidden in a drawer. Later that night, Duong was transported to the York Regional Police Headquarters for interrogation. Initially, he refused to answer questions and requested a lawyer. However, after learning that Dode Thi Trang and little Marcus Vu had died, his demeanor shifted. He began shaking his leg nervously and avoided eye contact. Although he gave no direct confession, his withdrawn behavior further reinforced investigators' assessment of his cold, calculated intent. Meanwhile, detectives actively interviewed witnesses and acquaintances from both sides to learn more about Duong's relationship with the Vu family. They learned that Duong had previously done business with Tue Vu. Some sources claim Duong had borrowed money from Vu for a venture, but lost it. Recently, Vu allegedly pressed him to repay, which may have created conflict. However, this information has not been verified and came only from a friend's account. Another theory suggested that Duong was involved in drug or weapons trafficking. While the Vu family had no involvement, Duong may have feared that Vu discovered his illegal activities and would report him to police, or that Vu had refused to help him in something unlawful, fueling resentment. Every theory was documented carefully for cross-referencing. At the same time, police examined the evidence seized during Duong's arrest. The Glock 19 was disassembled, fingerprints taken, and DNA swabbed. Results confirmed that the shell casings at the crime scene were fired from that very Glock. Duong's clothing was also tested for blood traces and gunshot residue, and GSR. Particles were found on his sleeve, consistent with recent firearm discharge. All collected evidence was sealed and placed in the evidence storage facility for prosecution. The case file was quickly completed, supported by solid physical evidence and clear witness testimony. Just one day after the crime, on the morning of the 22nd of June 2024, York Regional Police held a press conference announcing the arrest of Van Viet Duong, 41. He was officially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. These are extremely serious charges, reflecting prosecutors' belief that Duong acted intentionally and with premeditation. Police also emphasized that the suspect was in custody and no longer posed a threat to the public, a message that helped reassure the shaken Vaughan community after an extremely turbulent week. Suspect Van Viet Duong was a Vietnamese-Canadian whose family had long settled in Toronto. According to investigations, Duong had no stable occupation. He once invested in a small auto repair shop, but the business failed. Before the crime, Duong lived alone in a rented Toronto apartment with no wife or children. Neighbors described him as a quiet, reclusive man who rarely interacted with anyone and only occasionally returned home. Importantly, Duong had a criminal record. Aside from the January 2024 incident in which he rammed a police officer's vehicle, as previously mentioned, deeper investigation revealed he had been fined for assault in 2015 and was once suspected of involvement with illegal substances, though there was insufficient evidence to charge him. His behavior indicated he was a covert troublemaker who associated with unsavory individuals in Toronto. According to the Toronto Star, even some of Duong relatives had recently been charged with weapons and drug trafficking shortly before the shooting occurred. This raised suspicion that Duong may have been involved in organized crime with his family, or at least heavily influenced by a criminal environment. In his relationship with the victims, Tu Vu said he once trusted Duong and considered him a close business friend. At certain points, when Duong faced financial hardship, Vu even lent him money and frequently invited him over for meals like family. Trang Do also treated Duong kindly, often sending him holiday gifts and pastries. No one in the Vu family ever suspected that behind their backs, Duong was harboring such murderous intent. Criminal psychology experts suggested that Duong might have suffered from inferiority and resentment. He failed in life while his friends were happy and successful, fueling jealousy. The string of legal troubles in 2024 may have further stressed and destabilized him. He may have irrationally blamed Tu Vu or the Vu family for his life's misfortunes. His underlying motive could have been deep-seated revenge or personal hatred. However, as of June 2025, Duong has still refused to reveal the true reason behind his actions. The case file portrays Van Viet Duong as a two-faced individual, outwardly a familiar friend of the victim's family, but inwardly a dangerous offender with an unpredictable mindset. He had enough knowledge about the Vu family to exploit their trust and commit the brutal crime. After arranging the funeral for his wife and son, Tu Vu bravely spoke to the media. In an interview with the Toronto Star on June 30, he expressed profound grief while still struggling to understand the motive. "I can't comprehend why he did this. We treated him like a friend. Nothing can justify him taking the lives of my wife and my child." The family vowed to pursue justice for Trang Do and little Marcus. In July 2024, Van Viet Duong appeared at the Ontario Superior Court in Newmarket for a procedural hearing. He was denied bail. His defense attorney requested a psychiatric assessment for Duong at the end of 2024, but no official results have been released. In May 2025, the Ontario Crown Prosecution Office finalized the indictment with complete evidence, preparing the case for trial. The official trial is expected to take place in late 2025 or early 2026, where Duong will face 4 major charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors stated they will seek the harshest possible sentence. For now, Van Viet Duong remains in custody awaiting trial, maintaining silence toward all accusations. Therefore, the true motive behind the killings remains a mystery known only to him. Meanwhile, Tu Vu and his surviving 4-year-old son are trying each day to rebuild their lives. Vu has created a small memorial corner at home. On the table sits a photo of Trang holding baby Marcus. Smiling brightly beside it is Marcus's red Raptors cap, the item the child will never grow old enough to wear again. So, what punishment do you believe Van Viet Duong deserves under the law? Do you think he will spend the rest of his life in prison? Share your thoughts with Vietnamese Case Files in the comments. We look forward to discussing today's case with you. On the evening of February 8th, 2021, at approximately 7:08 p.m., several residents near the shopping plaza at the intersection of Lawrence Avenue East and Pharmacy Avenue were startled by a series of sharp gunshots. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, they hurried to call the police. Just minutes later, officers from the Toronto Police Service arrived at the scene. What they saw was a man lying motionless near the entrance of the commercial complex, his body covered in multiple blood-soaked gunshot wounds. Recognizing the situation as critical, emergency responders immediately administered first aid and performed CPR on the victim right at the scene. However, despite their efforts, the man did not survive. He took his final breath right there in the freezing winter night. The atmosphere at the scene was filled with shock and disbelief. Those who witnessed the aftermath were devastated, unable to imagine that on an ordinary evening, the shopping plaza could suddenly turn into a murder scene. Shortly afterward, police quickly cordoned off the area and began their investigation. The shopping plaza where the shooting occurred consisted of several small adjacent storefronts, with residential apartments located above. The dim yellow glow of streetlights reflected off the police tape stretched around the scene. Near the entrance where the victim's body lay, investigators observed large pools of blood spread across the sidewalk. Several handgun shell casings were scattered nearby, clear evidence that multiple shots had been fired in rapid succession. Around the victim, there were no obvious signs of a struggle, nor were there personal belongings such as a wallet or phone left behind, leaving police puzzled about the motive. Was this a robbery gone wrong, or a targeted execution? Furthermore, the victim had been shot multiple times, indicating that the attacker was determined and cold-blooded, intent on killing him at all costs. For this reason, from the very first moments, investigators sensed that this was not a simple case, especially given that the city had recently experienced a surge in violent incidents. Notably, despite the shooting occurring in a crowded area, no direct witnesses were able to identify the suspect. After firing the shots, the gunman vanished into the night, leaving behind very few concrete clues. As a result, police were forced to meticulously collect even the smallest details to support their investigation. As for the victim's identity, fortunately, someone in the crowd that night knew him and quickly provided police with valuable information. The victim was Cam Ton Tut, 62 years old, a Vietnamese man who had lived in Toronto for many years. He was known as a quiet, gentle, and hardworking man who went about his daily life within Toronto's diverse community. Some sources said he often visited the Lawrence Pharmacy Plaza area, where there are grocery stores, pharmacies, and small shops serving the community. This raised a question. Did Mr. Tut go to the shopping plaza that evening simply to pick up a few small items, or did he have an unusual appointment? No one truly knows the answer, only that this visit became the final moments of his life. In the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances, Mr. Tut was a decent man who had no conflicts with anyone. He belonged to the first generation of Vietnamese in Toronto and may have endured years of exhausting work in factories or small businesses to save money for his family. Though he lived quietly, he always greeted his neighbors warmly whenever they crossed paths. The tragedy that struck him left many people who knew him stunned and grief-stricken. They wondered whether there was any connection between him and the shooter, or whether this was entirely a random attack. At first, police ruled out no possibilities. The case of Cam Ton Tat therefore became even more mysterious. The victim was an honest man with no signs of criminal involvement, so why did he become the target of such a horrifying crime? What also drew significant attention was that the incident happened in Scarborough, a densely populated district in eastern Toronto, Canada. During the early months of the year, a period marked by harsh winter weather and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which often left streets quieter at night. In particular, the area around Lawrence Avenue East and Pharmacy Avenue, where the shooting took place, was traditionally a working-class neighborhood with many immigrants, including Vietnamese residents and other Asian communities. It was not typically considered a crime hotspot, but in recent years, gun violence in Toronto had been trending upward. Within 24 hours around the time of Mr. Tut's case, the city of Toronto witnessed 3 separate shootings in quick succession, shaking public opinion. Mr. Tut also became the 7th victim to lose his life in 2021. As a result, authorities grew deeply concerned about community safety, especially as violent crimes appeared to be involving younger and more aggressive offenders. Toronto Mayor John Tory and Toronto police had to issue frequent warnings about gang-related crimes, while emphasizing the need to strengthen security amid an extremely challenging climate. In that context, the Vietnamese community in Toronto, known for its close ties and hard work, was also shaken upon hearing that an elderly member of their community had been killed. Scarborough is home to many Vietnamese residents, and the death of Cam Ton Tut happened just before Lunar New Year, 2021, a time when families gather, making the atmosphere even more somber. Many people wondered how deeply the shadow of violence had crept into the neighborhood they had believed was peaceful. As for the authorities, as soon as it was confirmed to be a homicide, the Toronto Police Service mobilized its homicide investigators to the scene overnight. The crime scene examination was meticulous. Every shell casing and every bloodstain was numbered, photographed, and collected. Forensic technicians also screened for fingerprints or DNA that might have been left on the casings or in the surrounding area. The autopsy results for Mr. Tut confirmed the cause of death. He had been shot multiple times in vital areas, leading to acute blood loss. The shooting distance may have been quite close, suggesting the attacker moved in near Mr. Tutt before pulling the trigger. Ballistics analysis of the recovered bullets indicated the weapon used was most likely a semi-automatic handgun. Investigators did not rule out the possibility that the firearm had been used in another case, so they compared the ballistic data against prior incidents. At the same time, police also considered robbery as a motive, but the victim's belongings appeared to be intact, with his wallet still in his pocket. So if it wasn't robbery, could it have been a personal dispute? Detectives immediately interviewed Mr. Tutt's family and friends to find out whether he had recently argued with anyone or been threatened. But the answers they received were mostly the same. Mr. Tutt had no known enemies and no ongoing conflicts with anyone. This made the case an even harder puzzle, as a gentle Asian man had seemingly been killed for no reason in the middle of the street. In parallel, investigators fanned out to gather information. They knocked on doors and visited nearby businesses, asking whether anyone had seen or heard anything suspicious beyond the gunshots. Many people said they only heard a few pops and then saw a dark figure sprint past, but no one could clearly make out the suspect's face or identifying features in the darkness. As a result, eyewitness leads were extremely vague. However, in the age of technology, security cameras became the next witness, providing crucial support to the investigation. This commercial plaza had several cameras installed at grocery stores and beauty salons. Police collected all surveillance footage from around 7 p.m. that evening to determine whether any camera had captured the suspect. They also urged the public to submit any dash cam recordings from Lawrence Avenue East on the evening of February 8th if they had captured anything relevant. In the days following the killing, police provided frequent updates to the media in an effort to mobilize the entire community. A key lead began to emerge when video analysts spotted, in a blurry clip, the silhouette of a young male near the scene around the time of the homicide. The image was unclear, but it suggested a small framed figure wearing a dark jacket, moving quickly away from the plaza immediately after the gunshots. More importantly, the suspect appeared to be very young, possibly even a teenager. This detail was immediately cross-checked against youth offender records in the area. Police narrowed down several teen names who had previously been linked to incidents such as theft or weapons possession in Scarborough. Confidential community sources were also fully leveraged to track down additional leads. Then, just over 10 days after the killing, the investigation reached a breakthrough. On February 19, 2021, the Toronto Police Service announced that it had arrested a 16-year-old suspect directly connected to the murder of Kum Thon Tut. The teen was arrested early that morning, and later that afternoon he made his first court appearance via online video due to the pandemic. The arrest was carried out smoothly, suggesting the suspect may have been under close surveillance before he was taken into custody. One notable point was that his identity was not released because he was a minor, in accordance with Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. At the same time, the specific details that led to the arrest were not disclosed to the media. However, the decision to charge the 16-year-old with first-degree murder spoke to the seriousness of the evidence police had in hand. To lay such a charge, prosecutors must have grounds to show the killing was planned or deliberate in advance, or that it occurred in the course of committing another serious offense, such as armed robbery. After the suspect was arrested, the Scarborough community breathed a sigh of relief because the threat to public safety had been removed. Yet they were just as shaken to learn that the true perpetrator of this horrific crime was a teenager, only 16 years old. What could drive a boy of school age to act with such brutality? That question became the center of discussion across the area for a long time afterward. Some speculated that the attacker's motive might have been robbery, believing that Mr. Tutt was elderly and therefore an easier target. Others suggested it could have been a test of criminal nerve, encouraged by someone else. But all of this remained speculation, because to this day, authorities have not released any specific information about the motive or any connection between the teen and the victim. Police also did not reveal whether the two knew each other beforehand or were complete strangers. What sent chills through the public was the stark gap in age and status between the perpetrator, a boy barely past childhood, and the victim, a man old enough to be his father or uncle. If the suspect had any prior criminal history, those records would remain sealed due to his age. Even so, the fact that a teenager had access to a handgun and used it so proficiently in a busy public area suggested that this was not his first time being around weapons. So did he obtain the gun illegally on the street or borrow it from someone? If so, that would also be a serious crime. However, all details about the suspect, from his identity and background to his actions after the shooting, were handled tightly under the youth justice process. The public only knew that the suspect had been arrested and that justice was quietly moving forward. One key detail disclosed by lawmakers was that if he were tried as a youth, the maximum sentence under the law would be about 10 years, with 6 years in custody and 4 years under community supervision. If tried as an adult, the penalty for first-degree murder would be life imprisonment, with parole eligibility only after a minimum of 10 to 25 years. More importantly, regardless of how the legal outcome unfolded, the unjust death of Mr. Tutt could never be undone, and the person who caused it would also pay the price of losing his youth behind prison bars. The killing of Kum Than Tut in Scarborough sent powerful shockwaves through the local community and among Vietnamese people across Toronto. Canadian media covered the case extensively as a warning that gun violence spares no one. In this instance, the victim was not a gangster or a troublemaker, but a gentle, elderly Asian man with no bad reputation and no known controversies. This led many to reflect on personal safety, especially for seniors and immigrants, groups that are often more vulnerable in society. The fact that a 16-year-old committed a killing also sparked questions about the responsibilities of families and society in educating and guiding teenagers. Although police solved the case quickly and arrested the suspect, several unusual details still remained unresolved. What was the perpetrator's real motive? Was anyone encouraging him, or did he act alone? And most importantly, how could a teenager obtain a gun so easily? These questions point to a broader lesson about controlling weapons within the community, because once firearms fall into the hands of the reckless, they become an unpredictable and deadly threat. In terms of media impact, Mr. Tutt's case drew attention from both mainstream outlets and community news pages. English language, Vietnamese language, and Chinese language media all reported on it, underscoring the seriousness and heartbreak of what happened. While it did not become a nationwide media frenzy, the case remains a painful reminder that even in a multicultural city like Toronto, violence can happen to anyone. After this case, many elderly Asians became more cautious about going out at night, and the community called on authorities to provide stronger support, such as installing more public security cameras and increasing police patrols in quieter areas. And because of that, the lesson drawn from this case is truly profound. First, for vulnerable groups such as seniors and immigrants who are not fluent in the language, being careful about personal safety is extremely important. They should avoid walking alone in isolated places late at night, stay alert to their surroundings, and when they feel in danger, they should move toward crowded areas or call for help immediately. Second, the case highlights the darker side of youth when there is a lack of education and supervision. A teenager slipped deeper into the path of crime and committed the most horrific wrongdoing when society failed to intervene in time. Therefore, families, schools, and communities must work together to guide teenagers' values and prevent toxic, violent tendencies early on. In addition, the role of technology and the law is also underscored. Thanks to surveillance cameras and forensic evidence, police were able to quickly identify and arrest the perpetrator, bringing justice to the victim. This shows that investing in surveillance technology and investigative capabilities is necessary to deter crime. At the same time, the legal system must strike a balance between punishment and rehabilitation. For youth offenders, strict accountability is necessary, but there must also be mechanisms to help them reform through education and rehabilitation, so that when they return to society, they do not continue to reoffend. The case ended with a sealed sentence for the perpetrator, but the pain of Kum Than Tut's family will endure. His sudden death is a reminder that we must pay greater attention to community safety and to educating the younger generation. Somewhere in the city, church bells rang in farewell, seeing a gentle immigrant off to his final resting place. The evening of December 29, 2014, seemed like any other ordinary year-end night. Downstairs, Cindy was patiently helping the children with their homework. Upstairs, David, her husband, was resting after a long, exhausting day at work. No one could have imagined that within minutes, the entire family would be plunged into a horrifying tragedy. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Excited, the children rushed to answer it, and Cindy quickly followed, curious about who could be visiting so late at night. A few dozen seconds later, from upstairs, David heard a loud bang echo through the house. At first, he thought it was just an object falling. But as he ran halfway down the staircase, the sight before him froze him in place. His wife Cindy was lying sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around her. In that instant, he knew his wife had been shot. Chaos erupted inside the house. The children screamed in terror, while David trembled as he desperately tried to stop the bleeding. Sobbing uncontrollably, he struggled to keep her alive while calling the police for help. In the normally peaceful final days of the year in Canada, the sound of gunfire was extremely rare. For that very reason, police arrived at the scene quickly. The first responding officer immediately escorted David and Cindy's children into the kitchen to shield them from witnessing any further horror. Right there in the living room, Cindy lay motionless with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Blood continued to pour out as her body slowly turned cold and pale. David knelt beside her, choking back tears, his hands still desperately clinging to the last fragile traces of her life. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics did everything they could to save Cindy, but every effort was in vain. She took her last breath right there in the home she knew so well, where, just hours earlier, it had still been filled with children's laughter. In an instant, the family was shattered. The pain of losing a wife, losing a mother, right before the children's eyes was something no one could ever make up for. Police immediately launched an investigation. By procedure, family members, especially the husband, are always the first to be questioned. Still in shock, David repeated exactly what he had said in the 911 call. He didn't know who had knocked on the door because he had been upstairs at the time. Meanwhile, it was the children's account that truly revealed a critical lead. Through sobs, the son said it was his fault because he was the one who had opened the door for a strange man. That man then pulled out a gun and shot his mother. One sentence that could break anyone's heart. Both children described the killer as an older Asian man wearing glasses. He spoke to them in Vietnamese and asked about their grandfather. Hearing the conversation, Cindy came to the door to speak with him. Just seconds later, the man drew his gun, fired directly into her head, and then left in a dark-colored sedan. Based on this statement, police immediately began searching for an Asian man matching the description, along with a dark sedan seen in the area that night. A manhunt began in the freezing winter darkness, as the quiet calm of the small neighborhood had been shattered by a single, merciless gunshot. With what they had gathered, police did not believe this was a random attack. The shooter spoke Vietnamese and even asked about Cindy's grandfather. That raised a troubling suspicion. The gunman either knew Cindy or at least had some connection to her family. But the truth was that Cindy's parents were in Vietnam at the time of the shooting and were not in Canada at all. From there, police widened the scope of the investigation. They ran background checks on both Cindy and David, hoping to find a clue. A barrage of questions followed. Had Cindy been having an affair? Did she have any enemies? Was she involved in anything shady? But David answered firmly. He believed it could only have been a sudden attack because he could not imagine anyone wanting to harm Cindy. To him, Cindy was a kind and gentle 37-year-old woman who lived peacefully with her neighbors, was well-liked in the community, and had no reason to become the target of someone with a personal grudge. Police also considered whether local drug gangs might be involved, but there was no evidence to support that theory. David's background check showed nothing unusual either. His statement completely matched what the children had described, and David's grief, raw, desperate, and unmistakable, convinced investigators he had nothing to do with the crime. After clearing David as a suspect, police decided to move him and the children to a hotel temporarily. It was a safety measure, in case the killer returned to the scene. And the children were severely traumatized. They were so afraid they couldn't even go to the bathroom alone, because the horrifying memory of watching their mother murdered right in front of them was still painfully vivid. But before that first case could be solved, later on that same day, December 29th, police received another call from the other side of Edmonton. On the line was a woman who was deeply worried about her father, Phu Lam, 53 years old. She had been unable to reach him for hours. The last time they spoke, he had said unsettling things, as if he were warning her that she would never see him again. Her anxiety grew. Afraid her father might do something desperate, she contacted the police and asked them to go check on him. Phu Lam had been living with his wife, Tien, and their 2 children. After marrying him, Tien had also sponsored her parents and younger sister from Vietnam to come live in Canada. But recently, the couple had separated, each living in a different place. When officers arrived at the house, everything seemed quiet from the outside, with no obvious signs of trouble. They called the daughter back and said it appeared no one was home. But the daughter's instincts would not let it go. She urged police to look more carefully. Sure enough, detectives soon noticed footprints pressed into the snow around the house, one of them marked with a reddish stain, very likely blood. Immediately, the supervising inspector connected this to the earlier killing of Cindy Duong. Comparing the situations, police noticed a striking overlap. Both families were of Vietnamese origin. That raised the possibility that Phu's family had also become the target of the same attacker. Officers were immediately dispatched to reinforce the response at the house. At that moment, another call came into dispatch. A Vietnamese man reported that he had been unable to contact his wife for days because the two of them had been arguing. He was terrified because she was currently staying at Phu's house and she was not answering her phone. The woman he was referring to was Phu's sister-in-law. With all of these alarming pieces of information piling up, police did not hesitate any longer. They decided to enter the house. As they moved to force the door, they suddenly realized it was already unlocked. Officers stepped inside and were instantly overwhelmed by shock and horror. What they saw looked like a nightmare. Blood was everywhere. Furniture was overturned and scattered. On the tiled floor, long smears of blood suggested that bodies had been dragged from one place to another. Following the blood trail, they entered the living room. In front of them were 3 bodies lying in a straight line, already dead for many hours. The scene was so disturbing that even seasoned officers shuddered, as if they had walked into a horror film. But that was only the beginning. Upstairs, they found an 8-year-old boy lying motionless on a bed with a single gunshot wound to the head. Continuing the search, in another room, they discovered 2 more victims, also killed by gunshots to the head. In total, 7 bodies were found inside the house. It was a tragedy beyond imagination. Given the scale of the massacre, Police Chief Rod Knecht personally responded to the scene. He admitted that in his 39 years in law enforcement, he had never witnessed anything so horrifying. At first, one theory was raised. Could the killer have been one of the victims? But that idea was quickly ruled out because police found no firearm at the scene. They concluded that the 3 bodies downstairs had been moved, possibly shot in different locations, then dragged into the living room and arranged in a line. The victims were identified as 3 generations of the same Vietnamese-Canadian family. Thuy Tien Trung, 35 years old, was found down near the front entrance. Beside her was her son, Elvis Lam, 8 years old. In the living room, Thi Do Lay, 55 years old, Tien's biological mother, lay next to Van Dun Trung, 55 years old, Mrs. Lay's ex-husband and Tien Trung's father. Tien's younger sister, Than Ha Thi Trung, 33 years old, was found dead near her 3-year-old daughter, Valentina Nguyen. In addition to the family members, the scene also included Viet Nguyen, 41 years old, a close friend of Thuy Tien Trung who was considered like family. 7 people, bound by blood and deep affection, now able to reunite only in death. Yet Phu Lam, the man police had originally been searching for, was not among them. So where could he be? Had he been harmed elsewhere, or was he the one who had caused this massacre? Police immediately contacted Phu Lam's daughter, the woman who had first asked them to look for her father, to learn more. And it was from her that they uncovered a far from simple family tree, along with Phu's violent temper and history of aggression. Phu Lam was born in 1961 in Vietnam. He immigrated to Canada in 1979 when he was only 18. Over the years, he worked various manual jobs: electrician, mechanic, restaurant, kitchen helper, and more. In the early 2000s, he ran small businesses and at times managed to get by. However, he developed a severe gambling addiction. According to court records, Lam frequently gambled at local casinos and sank deeper and deeper into crushing debt. So was it financial pressure that drove this man into desperation? But if he only wanted to end his own life, to escape debt, why take so many others with him? When Canadian police dug further into Phu Lam's legal history, they were stunned to find a long trail of charges dating back to the late 1980s. Specifically, in the late 1980s, Lam was charged with assault and aggravated assault. Though records did not clearly state the outcome, it may have been settled or there was insufficient evidence. In 1997, he was charged with uttering threats to kill, assault with a weapon, and possession of a dangerous weapon, but those charges were ultimately withdrawn. In September 1999, Phu Lam became entangled in another serious case and was arrested on allegations of manufacturing an illegal substance and possessing drugs for the purpose of trafficking an amount under 3 kilograms. However, both charges were later dropped, and the specific reason was not stated. In 2001, he was sentenced to 90 days in custody for firearms and drug-related violations. In other words, despite repeated run-ins with the law, most cases were eventually dismissed or stayed, suggesting that Lam often slipped through legal gaps or faced only light penalties. Still, it was clear that Phu Lam was never a gentleman, even before the killings. That became even more evident when looking at his relationships within the family. Lam's daughter said he frequently beat his wife simply for not obeying and controlled everything from who she could befriend to what she wore. Perhaps suffocated by that oppressive home life, Tien developed feelings for another man named Viet, who was also among the victims found inside Lam's house. Everything reached a breaking point when Lam found out about this and forced his wife to take a DNA test for Elvis. That was when he learned that Elvis was not his biological son. Being cheated on and realizing that for the past 8 years he had been raising someone else's child was the final straw for a controlling man like him. He bluntly declared that he would deal with his wife's entire family, and he even asked around everywhere to buy a gun. Lam once texted his first wife, whom he had divorced, to ask whether she could help him buy a gun, but his ex-wife urged him to drop that reckless idea and think about their 2 children. Only then did Lam calm down temporarily. But out of sheer fear of her husband, in November 2012, Thoe Tien Truong reported him to police and filed for an emergency protection order. The judge immediately approved an order barring Lam from approaching his wife and children, and Edmonton police also charged Lam with forcible confinement, assault, and uttering threats to kill multiple people in late 2012. However, for reasons unknown, 2 months later, Thoe Tien Truong and family witnesses withdrew their statements, leaving prosecutors without sufficient grounds to proceed. As a result, all charges against Lam were dropped on December 21, 2012. The emergency protection order also expired because Thoe Tien Truong did not attend the follow-up hearing. And so, once again, another case ended without any punishment for Lam. In early 2013, the couple finally separated. Thoe Tien and the children moved in with her biological parents, while Lam most likely lived elsewhere but still kept a key to the Lakeview house, which was jointly owned by the couple. Lam's personal life was unhappy, and his work situation grew increasingly difficult. By 2014, he was unemployed and drowning in debt due to gambling losses. He filed for bankruptcy in early 2014 with nearly $375,000 in debt, yet the financial burden still closed in on him. In December 2014, just a few weeks before the case occurred, the court ordered him to repay part of his credit-related debt, more than $12,750, starting in mid-January 2015. Economic pressure weighing on a man who was already mentally unstable may have further pushed Phu Lam toward collapse in the final stage of his life. And indeed, according to Lam's eldest daughter, when he went to see her that day, he spoke as if saying goodbye and asked her to take care of her 1-year-old half-brother and another baby who was only 8 months old. But police still could not confirm whether Phu Lam was a victim or the perpetrator in this case. Therefore, the top priority remained finding him before it was too late. By tracking Lam's phone location, police discovered it was about 16 miles east of Edmonton. There, they found Mrs. Tien's car, his wife's, parked outside a Vietnamese restaurant in Fort Saskatchewan. This was also where Phu Lam had once worked. At the time, the restaurant was closed for the holidays, and the area was eerily quiet. Police even deployed a tactical unit, preparing for the possibility of a confrontation. They then shouted for anyone inside to raise their hands and come out, but received no response. When they entered the restaurant, they found the person they were looking for, Phu Lam, lying motionless on the floor with a gunshot wound to the head. A gun lying right beside him indicated that he had taken his own life. Police immediately recovered the firearm. A check showed it was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, with markings consistent with the weapon used at the 2 earlier scenes, directly confirming that Phu Lam was the perpetrator behind this tragedy. The bloody chain of events ended in less than 48 hours, yet many mysteries remained unanswered. Now, the investigators' task was to reconstruct every step of Phu Lam's crimes, and, more importantly, to decode what motive could have driven him to such brutality. Multiple investigative tracks were launched in parallel. Forensic teams examined the bodies and confirmed that all 8 victims died from gunshot wounds. The estimated times of death aligned with the initial theory. 7 people in the Lakeview house were killed in the early morning of December 28th, while Cindy was shot on the evening of December 29th. All the pieces gradually formed the image of a pressure cooker life finally exploding. A middle-aged man broken by a failed marriage, crushed by financial ruin, with a history of violence and deep hatred toward his own family. Layer upon layer of danger, depression, jealousy, and family separation converged in Phu Lam before he struck. In the end, he turned his gun on nearly 10 people close to him, including children, before taking his own life. However, there was one exception, Cindy Duong, someone completely unrelated, not a relative, and not close to Phu Lam in any way. As the motive behind the family massacre became clearer, the biggest remaining question for police was, why did Phu Lam target Cindy Duong, a complete stranger? The investigation expanded to explore any connection between Phu Lam's family and the Duong family. Police discovered that Phu Lam and Cindy Duong's father had once known each other. However, believing that Cindy's father had tried to lure away his wife, Phu Lam turned on his former friend, insulting him. The two argued and ultimately cut ties. For that reason, police believe that after carrying out the massacre at his home, Phu Lam knew he had no way out and would end his own life. But in a fury, he wanted to settle one last debt with Cindy's father. He went to his former friend's house but did not find him, so he took his rage out on the enemy's daughter for no reason, despite her having nothing to do with their conflict. That merciless act stole the life of an innocent mother and left an unbearable grief for her husband and children. In other words, Cindy was purely an unfortunate victim, wrong place, wrong time. She had no prior conflict with Phu Lam and no involvement with him whatsoever. Even so, details about the true target Phu Lam was seeking at the Duong home were not made public, likely out of respect for the privacy of those involved. In the end, based on the evidence gathered, police were able to partially reconstruct the sequence of this horrific case. In Christmas 2014, while countless families were happily reunited, Phu Lam carried his hatred alone. He knew that during the holiday, his wife's side of the family would be gathering in full at Tien's house in Edmonton, and that was the opportunity he had been waiting for. There is considerable evidence suggesting that on the night of December 27th or December 28th, Lam secretly surveilled the Lakeview house, where his wife and their son Elvis were living with her parents and younger sister. Because on the evening of December 28th, the ex-husband of Ha, Lam's sister-in-law, reported that when he came to visit his child, he saw Lam's black SUV parked nearby. Most likely, Lam stayed inside the vehicle all night, watching every movement. From his hiding place, he could also identify the presence of Ong Viet, the man believed to be his wife's lover, who had come to celebrate a late Christmas with Tien's family. For someone fueled by years of resentment like Lam, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Everyone he hated was gathered under the same roof. A cruel intent ignited in his mind. He wanted to settle everything in one night. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, on December 29, 2014, Phu Lam began to act. Based on traces at the scene, police believed he slipped in through the back door or a side entrance. Inside the house, Tien and her mother, Ba Lei, had just fallen asleep after a long day. Little Elvis was in his own room. Ong Viet was likely sleeping on the living room sofa. Ong Trung, the father-in-law, was resting in another room, and Ha slept with 3-year-old Valentina while her 8-month-old baby lay in a crib beside them. The house was silent, with only dim night lights casting faint shadows along the hallway. Phu Lam stepped inside without a sound. There is reason to believe his first target was Ong Viet, his longtime romantic rival. He approached and fired at close range, killing the victim almost instantly. The gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. Ong Trung jolted awake and rushed into the hallway, immediately facing Phu Lam with a gun in hand. Before he could say a word, he was shot down at the doorway. Hearing the commotion, Ba Lei and Tien sprang up in panic. By a mother's instinct, Tien ran toward her son Elvis's room to check on him, while Ba Lei opened her bedroom door and came face to face with her former son-in-law, then was shot. After dealing with his former mother-in-law, Lum turned his gun on his wife. By this point, his four main targets, his wife, her parents, and his rival, had fallen one by one. In another room, Ha trembled as she clutched Valentina tightly, trying to find somewhere to hide, but the terrified cries of the 3-year-old echoed through the house. Fu Lam entered, his face ice cold. Ha may have begged him to spare her innocent child, but to Lam, everyone connected by blood to his wife's family had to be erased. He raised the gun and shot both Ha and little Valentina. The mother collapsed, her arms still wrapped around her daughter in her final moment. In the midst of that carnage, 2 tiny lives were still left breathing. A 1-year-old girl, the child of Lam and Thoi Tien Trung, and an 8-month-old boy, Than Ha's baby. No one knows for certain what was going through Fu Lam's mind at that moment, but the truth is he did not harm the 2 babies. He carried both children out of the blood-soaked house at dawn, then drove straight to his eldest daughter's home in the north of the city. He knocked on the door and entrusted the 2 children to her care. Even though he tried to appear calm, his tension and dazed, shaken look were impossible to hide. His daughter quickly noticed and sensed something was wrong, but before she could ask more, Lam hurried back to his car and drove away. He drove the black SUV around Edmonton throughout December 29th. In the afternoon, Fu Lam appeared at the home of another relative in a southwest neighborhood of the city and stayed there for a few hours. At around 6 o'clock that evening, December 29th, Fu Lam left that acquaintance's house and, alone, drove straight to the nearby Hadao area. At that point, there was only one goal in his mind: to confront the person he believed had destroyed his family's happiness. The SUV stopped in front of Cindy Duong's home on Haswell Court at around 6:50 p.m. Fu Lam walked up and rang the doorbell, his weapon already loaded. As soon as the door opened, Fu Lam immediately asked for someone, but received a confused reply that the person was not there. Realizing his prey was absent, his rage exploded to its peak. In an instant, Fu Lam aimed the weapon at the woman in front of him. Then a sharp gunshot rang out. Cindy collapsed onto the floor, blood soaking deep red into the living room carpet. Her 3 young children screamed in terror. David, Cindy's husband, rushed downstairs. But Fu Lam spun around and sprinted out the front door, vanishing into the night before David could do anything. Everything happened too fast. By the time David fell to his knees and held his wife, Cindy had already taken her last breath. After attacking his final victim, Fu Lam sped away from the Hadao scene. The lone man drove more than 30 kilometers northeast, crossing bleak, snow-white fields to the quiet town of Fort Saskatchewan. Fu Lam's final destination was the Asian restaurant Vietnamese Express, where he had once worked in maintenance and which was also a business connected to his ex-wife. He slipped into the restaurant through the back door. Inside was pitch dark and cold. Outside, Edmonton was gradually brightening, signaling the new day of December 30th, 2014. Inside, Fu Lam silently sank down onto the kitchen floor he knew so well. At around 8:30 in the morning, as the tactical police perimeter began closing in outside the restaurant, Fu Lam raised the weapon to his head and pulled the trigger, ending his life in loneliness and darkness. On January 2nd, 2015, Edmonton police held a press conference, officially confirming Fu Lam as the sole perpetrator of the massacre and releasing the identities of all 8 victims. The investigation concluded once every key piece of evidence had been clarified, from the perpetrator's chain of actions, to the type of weapon used, to the deeper root cause originating from family conflict. Authorities also emphasized that this was a calculated, deliberate act of domestic violence, unrelated to any criminal gang. Edmonton Police Chief Rod Knecht even called the massacre an extreme case of domestic violence and urged the community to stay vigilant and proactively report warning signs in neighboring families to prevent similar tragedies. Because Fu Lam, the sole perpetrator, died, there would be no criminal trial. Even so, the case raised legal and social questions worth reflecting on. Right after the tragedy, authorities in Alberta reviewed how serious domestic violence cases are handled. This was because Fu Lam's case had shown multiple warning signs beforehand, yet he ultimately avoided punishment after the victim withdrew her statement. Some public opinion criticized the justice system for failing to effectively protect Thoi Tien Truong's family. If, Back in 2012, Phu Lam had been convicted and placed under stricter supervision. Would the 2014 tragedy still have happened? While this is a hypothetical that cannot be answered with certainty, it fueled debate about creating more effective protections for victims of domestic abuse, rather than relying only on routine administrative procedures. On another front, the gun Phu Lam used throughout the case was confirmed to have been stolen in 2006 in the province of British Columbia. But how did Lam obtain the gun? This was not made public. He may have bought it on the black market, or obtained it through someone connected to underground gangs. Either way, the case reignited concerns about firearm control. A weapon lost 8 years earlier and never recovered went on to cause catastrophic consequences. It was also a warning to authorities about the urgent need to trace and recover missing firearms. In the aftermath, many prayer services and memorials were held. On January 4th, 2015, hundreds of people, mostly Vietnamese Canadians, gathered at Thien Vien Truc Lam, Edmonton, to pray for the victims. Amid thick incense smoke, the sound of chanting filled the space, moving many to tears as people prayed for peace for all beings. Notably, at this ceremony, Tam Nguyen, the husband of Ha Truong, who lost both his wife and daughter to Phu Lam, said he would forgive the perpetrator. A Buddhist Tum believed that what had happened could not be changed, and that clinging to hatred would only make everything worse. Forgiveness, he said, was a way for the deceased to find peace. Tam's decision to forgive his in-law, even after that man had killed his wife and child, earned widespread respect. His message helped bring a measure of closure to a tragedy that shook the Maple Leaf Country through compassion and a spirit of healing, easing, at least in part, the pain felt by the entire community. And you, what thoughts does this case leave you with? Let Vietnamese Case Files know in the comments. And if you found today's story compelling, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Vietnamese Case Files so you won't miss more gripping cases in the future. Goodbye, and see you next time.